Welcome to Sheriff Files. Please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from tonight. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. Trees don't bleed. But this one did. I've been sheriff in Millbrook County for 37 years, and I've seen enough to know that some things don't have explanations that'll satisfy a reasonable man. This particular thing happened back in September of '92, but I still wake up some mornings with the taste of copper pennies in my mouth and the sound of something dripping in the walls of my house. The first call came from Martha Hendricks on a Tuesday afternoon. Martha ran the general store and kept tabs on everyone's business better than most folk kept tabs on their own. She said animals were acting strange out by Cutter's Ridge, where the old logging road peters out into nothing but deer trails and blackberry tangles. They won't cross the creek, she told me, wringing her hands like she was washing them in invisible water. Dogs turn tail and run. Even the crows won't fly over that stretch of woods. I might have dismissed it as old woman worry, but Martha wasn't given to flights of fancy. She was practical as a hammer and twice as hard. If she said something was wrong, something was wrong. The second call came 3 days later from Jimmy Walsh, who trapped beaver and muskrat in the wetlands north of town. Jimmy was pale as milk when he showed up at my office, his usual swagger nowhere to be found. "Sheriff, there's something you need to see," he said, and his voice had a tremor in it I'd never heard before. "Something that ain't natural." He led me out to his truck, where a cage held what should have been a red squirrel. Should have been, but wasn't quite. The thing was the right size and shape, but its fur had gone white as fresh snow, and its eyes were clouded over like cataracts. It sat perfectly still, not the twitchy alertness you'd expect from a trapped squirrel. It sat like it was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. "Found it about a quarter mile from where the animals won't go," Jimmy said. "Just sitting on a stump, staring at nothing. Didn't even run when I walked right up to it." I studied the creature, and it studied me back with those milky eyes. There was something in its gaze that made my skin crawl, a kind of ancient patience that didn't belong in a squirrel's face. "Where exactly did you find it?" Jimmy pointed northeast, toward the ridge where the old-growth forest still held court over valleys that hadn't felt an axe in over a century. "Near the big oak. You know the one I mean." I did know it. Everyone in Millbrook knew about the oak. It was older than the town, older than the county, maybe older than the state itself. Local kids dared each other to touch its trunk, and local parents warned them away from it. It was the kind of tree that featured in whispered stories and childhood nightmares, standing alone in a clearing like it had killed everything else around it just by being there. "I'll take a look," I told Jimmy, though something in my gut was already telling me I wouldn't like what I found. The next morning, I drove out the logging road as far as my patrol car could manage, then walked the rest of the way. The forest was too quiet, like someone had thrown a blanket over the whole world and muffled all the sounds. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the carpet of dead leaves, and more than once I caught myself looking over my shoulder at shadows that didn't quite sit right. The creek Jimmy had mentioned was running lower than it should have been for September, exposing smooth stones that hadn't seen daylight in years. The water that remained was clear but somehow wrong, like looking through glass that had been manufactured with a flaw you couldn't quite identify. I followed the creek upstream, guided by an increasingly unpleasant smell that reminded me of the time a possum died in the walls of the courthouse, and we couldn't find it for a week. Sweet and rotten and somehow metallic, like pennies left in the rain. The clearing opened up ahead of me with the suddenness of a held breath being released. And there it was. The oak was massive, easily 12 feet across at the base, its trunk disappearing into the canopy so far above that I couldn't make out where it ended and the sky began. The bark was deeply furrowed, scarred by centuries of weather and time, but what caught my attention wasn't its size or age. It was the dark stain running down the trunk. From about 8 feet up, a thick, viscous substance was seeping from the bark and flowing down the tree like slow tears. It was dark red, almost black in some places, and it had pooled at the base of the tree in a sticky, reeking puddle that swarmed with flies. I've seen plenty of bleeding in my time as sheriff. Gunshots, knife wounds, car accidents that turned people into hamburger. But this was different. This didn't look like blood from any creature I'd ever encountered. It was too thick, too dark, and it moved wrong, like it was alive in ways that blood shouldn't be. The smell was overwhelming up close, that sweet sick stench of decay mixed with something else, something I couldn't identify but that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. I pulled out my handkerchief and held it over my nose, but it didn't help much. The ground around the tree was bare earth, packed hard as cement. Nothing grew within a 20-foot radius of the trunk, not even weeds. Beyond that dead zone, the forest resumed as if nothing was wrong, but I noticed that all the trees were leaning away from the oak, their branches reaching in any direction except toward the bleeding giant. I circled the tree slowly, looking for anything that might explain the seepage. Lightning strike, disease, insect damage, anything that would make sense. But the bark appeared healthy everywhere except where that dark fluid was oozing out, and there were no obvious wounds or holes to account for the bleeding. As I completed my circuit, I noticed something else. Bones. Small ones, scattered around the base of the tree like offerings. Bird bones mostly, but some that looked like they might have come from squirrels or chipmunks. They were clean, picked white, and they didn't look like the remains of predator kills. They looked deliberate, arranged. I was studying a particularly intact skull, something that might have belonged to a raccoon, when I heard it. A sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic, coming from somewhere above me. I looked up into the canopy, searching for whatever animal might be making the noise, but I could see nothing but leaves and shadow. The breathing continued, steady as a heartbeat, and after a moment I realized it was synchronized with the dripping of the dark fluid. Inhale, drip. Exhale, drip. Like the tree was breathing, and every breath pushed more of that foul substance from its wounded bark. I backed away from the oak, my skin crawling with the certainty that I was being watched. The forest around me had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just that rhythmic breathing and the steady drip of whatever was leaking from the tree. By the time I got back to my car, my hands were shaking and my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool September air. I drove back to town faster than I should have, and I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that what I'd seen had a rational explanation. But the smell followed me home. It clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. I took 3 showers that night, and could still detect it, faint but persistent, like the memory of something rotten. The calls started coming in the next day. Mrs. Chin, who raised chickens behind her house on Maple Street, reported that her birds wouldn't come out of their coop. They huddled together in the corners, making soft, distressed sounds she'd never heard before. The Hendricks boy found his dog cowering under the porch, whimpering and refusing to eat. When he tried to coax the animal out, it bared its teeth and growled, not at him, but at something behind him that wasn't there. Old Pete Morrison, who'd been hunting these woods for 60 years, called to say that the deer population had vanished overnight. "It's like they packed up and moved to the next county," he told me. "Never seen anything like it." But the strangest call came from Sarah Webb, the librarian. She'd been having nightmares, she said, about trees and darkness and the sound of something huge breathing in the woods. The dreams were so vivid she'd wake up gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat and her mouth full of the taste of copper. "The funny thing is," she said, I've never been to that part of the woods. I don't even like camping. But I know exactly what that tree looks like, and I know exactly where to find it. She wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, I got similar reports from a dozen different people. All of them described the same dreams, the same tree, the same overwhelming sense of dread that lingered long after they woke up. And all of them had the same strange detail. They could taste metal in their mouths, like they'd been sucking on pennies. I knew I had to go back. This time I'd brought backup, Deputy Collins, who was young enough to think he was immortal and smart enough to keep his mouth shut about things that didn't make sense. I also brought a camera, sample bottles, and a portable pH meter, thinking that if I could document whatever was happening, I might be able to find someone who could explain it. We parked at the same spot and hiked in during the late afternoon, when the light was starting to take on that golden quality that photographers love and lawmen learn to distrust. The forest seemed even quieter than before, if that was possible. Our footsteps sounded like gunshots in the silence. Collins stopped dead when we reached the clearing. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and I didn't correct his language. The bleeding had gotten worse. Much worse. The dark fluid was now seeping from multiple points on the trunk, creating rivulets that ran down the bark like veins. The pool at the base of the tree had expanded, and I could see that it was moving slightly, rippling as if something was stirring beneath the surface. The smell hit us like a physical blow, so strong that Collins doubled over and retched into the bushes. I managed to keep my composure, but just barely. It was the same sweet sick stench as before, but intensified and mixed with something new, the sharp, acrid smell of electrical fire. "What the hell is that thing?" Collins gasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. I didn't answer, because I was staring at something that made my blood turn to ice water. The bones around the base of the tree had been rearranged since my last visit. They were no longer scattered randomly but laid out in deliberate patterns, forming shapes that hurt to look at directly. Symbols, maybe, or letters in some alphabet I didn't recognize. And they weren't just animal bones anymore. Mixed in with the skulls and ribs of woodland creatures were pieces that looked uncomfortably human-sized. Collins had noticed them too. "Sheriff," he said, his voice barely audible. "Are those—" "I don't know." I cut him off, though I was afraid I didn't know. I took out my camera and started documenting everything, the flash popping in the gathering dusk like small lightning strikes. Each time the light flared, the shadows around the tree seemed to move in ways that didn't match the movement of the branches above. When I knelt to collect a sample of the dark fluid, my hand started shaking so badly I could barely hold the bottle. The substance was warm to the touch, almost hot, and it had a consistency like syrup mixed with motor oil. When I held the bottle up to the light, I could see things floating in it, small, dark specks that moved with purpose rather than drifting randomly. "We need to go," Collins said, and his voice had taken on a high, tight quality that meant he was fighting panic. "We need to go right now." He was right. The sun was setting, and the forest around us was changing. The shadows were growing longer and darker, but more than that, they were growing more solid. I could feel them pressing against us like cold hands, and the breathing sound I'd heard before was getting louder, more urgent. As we packed up our equipment, I noticed that the dark fluid was dripping faster now, keeping time with the accelerated breathing. The sound was coming from all directions, as if the entire forest was breathing along with the tree, and the rhythm was gradually speeding up like a heartbeat under stress. We were halfway back to the car when Collins grabbed my arm. "Sheriff," he whispered, "look behind us." I turned around and felt my knees go weak. The clearing was glowing with a faint, sickly light that seemed to emanate from the tree itself. The dark fluid on the trunk was luminescent, tracing glowing veins down the bark like some kind of infection spreading through the wood. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silhouettes I could see moving around the base of the tree. Tall, thin shapes that moved with jerky, unnatural gaits, like marionettes being controlled by a drunk puppeteer. They appeared to be tending to the bone arrangements, adjusting the patterns with long, spindly fingers that ended in points. One of them looked up toward us, and even at that distance, I could see its face. Or where its face should have been. Instead, there was just a smooth expanse of pale skin with two dark holes where eyes might go, and a slash of a mouth that was too wide and filled with too many teeth. Collins made a sound like a wounded animal and started running. I was right behind him, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or dignity. Behind us, I could hear something else running, keeping pace with us but staying just out of sight. The sound of its footsteps was wrong. Too many legs, or legs that bent in directions that legs shouldn't bend. We reached the car and threw ourselves inside, Collins fumbling with the keys while I locked the doors and rolled up the windows. The engine turned over on the third try, and we tore out of there like the devil himself was chasing us. Maybe he was. We didn't speak during the drive back to town. What was there to say? That we'd seen something that couldn't exist? That there were things in our woods that belonged in nightmares rather than reality? That the old oak tree wasn't just bleeding, but was somehow alive and feeding and tending a garden of bones? I filed a report, but I kept it vague. Unexplained animal disturbances. Possible environmental contamination. Recommend avoiding the area until further investigation. I sent copies to the State Wildlife Department and the County Health Office, knowing that nothing would come of it. Bureaucrats don't have procedures for dealing with bleeding trees and shadow puppets. The nightmares started that night. Not just for me, but for Collins too, and eventually for everyone in town who'd been exposed to whatever was happening out there. The same dream Sarah Webb had described, but worse. More detailed. More real. In the dreams, I was always walking through the forest toward the clearing, but the path never ended. The trees on either side grew taller and more twisted as I walked, their branches reaching across the trail like gnarled fingers trying to snatch at my clothes and hair. The breathing sound was constant, a rhythmic wheeze that seemed to come from the earth itself. And always, I could taste copper in my mouth. The worst part was that the dreams felt more real than waking life. When I was asleep, walking through that nightmare forest, everything made perfect sense. The bleeding tree, the shadow figures, the bone arrangements, it all fit together into a pattern that my sleeping mind could almost grasp. It was only when I woke up that the wrongness of it all came crashing back. I tried to research the tree, digging through county records and old newspapers, looking for any mention of strange occurrences in that part of the woods. What I found wasn't comforting. The area had a history. Native tribes had avoided it, calling it a hungry place, in their language. Early settlers reported livestock disappearing near the ridge, and several homesteads in the area had been mysteriously abandoned with no record of where the families had gone. In 1847, a traveling preacher named Jeremiah Blackwood had established a small congregation in a clearing near the ridge. The church records, such as they were, spoke of strange miracles and unexplained phenomena. Blackwood claimed to have visions of angels, but his descriptions of these heavenly visitors sounded more like the shadow figures Collins and I had seen. The congregation disappeared in the winter of 1849. All of them, 43 people, including women and children, vanished without a trace. The only thing searchers found was a circle of bones arranged around a massive oak tree, and a journal written in Blackwood's hand that described something he called the bleeding god that lived in the roots of the world. The journal pages I was able to read were nearly incoherent, filled with rambling passages about sacrifice and transcendence, and the thin places where reality wore through like old cloth. But one passage stood out, written in a steadier hand than the rest. The tree dreams, and in dreaming, it bleeds. Each drop carries the memory of what was, the hunger of what is, and the promise of what will be. We are the gardeners now, tending the roots with our bones and feeding the dream with our substance. Soon the tree will wake, and the dream will spill over into the waking world like wine from a broken cup. I closed the journal and sat back in my chair, my hands shaking slightly. Outside my office window, the afternoon sun was shining on Main Street, and people were going about their normal business, shopping, talking, living their ordinary lives. It seemed impossible that something as mundane as a bleeding tree could threaten all of that normalcy, but I had the growing certainty that it could and would. The calls kept coming. More animals acting strangely, more people having the same nightmares, more reports of shadows moving in the woods where shadows shouldn't be. And slowly, gradually, the effects were spreading closer to town. Mrs. Patterson's garden died overnight, all her vegetables withering as if they'd been drained of life. The water in Miller's pond turned dark and began to smell like copper, driving away the fish and the ducks that usually congregated there. Children started having trouble sleeping, waking up screaming about trees with faces and men made of sticks and shadows. I knew I had to do something, but what? Call the state police and tell them we had a supernatural emergency? Contact the CDC about a tree that might be infectious? There was no protocol for this, no procedure to follow when reality started coming apart at the seams. In the end, it was Collins who made the decision for us. He came to my office on a Friday morning, his face pale and his hands shaking like a man in the grip of fever. "I can't take it anymore," he said. "The dreams, the smell, the feeling that something's watching me all the time. It's killing me, Sheriff. Literally killing me. I've lost 15 pounds in 2 weeks, and I can't keep food down." He looked terrible, I realized. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken, and there was a gray pallor to his skin that spoke of serious illness. But worse than his physical appearance was the haunted look in his eyes, the expression of a man who'd seen too much and couldn't unsee it. "We have to go back," he said. "We have to end this." "How?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew his answer. "Fire," he said simply. "Burn it down. Burn the whole damned clearing if we have to." It was a desperate plan, maybe even a foolish one, but I couldn't think of anything better. And Collins was right about one thing: whatever was happening was killing us slowly, eating away at the town and its people like a cancer. We went that same night, armed with gasoline, road flares, and a chainsaw. The plan was simple: cut down the tree, douse it with fuel, and burn everything in the clearing. If that didn't work, at least we'd have tried. The forest was different at night. Not just darker, but actively hostile. The trees seemed to close in around us as we walked, and I could swear I heard whispers in the wind, voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. The path that had been clear during our previous visits kept trying to lead us in circles, and twice we had to backtrack when we realized we were walking away from our destination rather than toward it. The clearing, when we finally reached it, was alive with activity. The shadow figures were there in force, dozens of them moving around the tree in complex patterns that my eyes couldn't quite follow. They tended the bone arrangements like gardeners tending flower beds, adding new pieces and adjusting the patterns with careful precision. The tree itself was worse than ever. The bleeding had spread to cover most of the trunk, and the dark fluid was flowing so freely that it had created streams running away from the base in all directions. The luminescence was brighter too, casting eerie shadows that moved independently of their sources. But it was the sounds that nearly broke my nerve. The breathing had become a rhythmic roar, like some immense bellows working in the depths of the earth. And underneath that, I could hear voices, human voices, crying out in ecstasy or agony. I couldn't tell which. "Dear God," Collins whispered, "what have we stumbled into?" I didn't answer, because I was staring at the bone arrangements. They had evolved since our last visit, becoming more complex and somehow more meaningful. I still couldn't read them like text, but I could sense the intention behind them, the message they were trying to convey. They were a summoning circle, an invitation, a doorway being carefully constructed from the remains of the tree's previous victims. "We need to do this fast," I told Collins, hefting the chainsaw, "before they notice us." But it was already too late. The shadow figures had stopped their work and were turning toward us with movements that were smooth as oil and twice as unnatural. Up close, I could see that they weren't quite human-shaped after all. They were too tall, too thin, and their joints bent in directions that made my eyes water to look at directly. One of them approached us, moving with the gliding gait of something that had never learned to walk on solid ground. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through dry leaves, barely recognizable as language. "You have seen the bleeding," it said. "You have tasted the copper dream. You belong to the tree now, as we all belong." I raised the chainsaw and pulled the ripcord. The engine snarled to life, cutting through the supernatural quiet like a buzz saw through silk. The shadow figure recoiled, its form wavering like smoke in a strong wind. "You cannot harm the dreamer," it hissed. "The tree has roots deeper than your understanding, branches that reach into worlds you cannot imagine. Cut the trunk, and it will grow back stronger. Burn the wood, and it will bloom from the ashes." Maybe it was right, but I had to try. I advanced on the massive oak, the chainsaw howling in my hands like a living thing. The shadow figures retreated, but they didn't disappear. They formed a circle around the clearing, watching and waiting for me to fail. The chainsaw blade bit into the bark with a spray of dark fluid that splattered my clothes and face. It was warm, almost hot, and it tasted like copper pennies when it hit my lips. The tree shuddered as I cut, and the breathing sound became a roar of pain or rage. But the chainsaw was cutting. Slowly, laboriously, but it was cutting. Chips of wood mixed with the dark fluid, and I could see a wedge forming in the massive trunk. If I could just keep going, just cut deep enough. The chainsaw died. Not the engine, that was still running. But the chain had stopped moving, frozen in place as if the tree had somehow grabbed it and refused to let go. I pulled the trigger again and again, but the chain wouldn't budge. Around me, the shadow figures began to laugh. It was a sound like wind chimes made of bone, brittle and hollow and infinitely sad. "The tree dreams of bleeding," one of them said. "And the dreamer cannot be killed by the dream." I threw the useless chainsaw aside and grabbed one of the containers of gasoline. If I couldn't cut the tree down, maybe I could at least damage it enough to slow whatever was happening. I doused the base of the trunk with fuel, the liquid mixing with the dark fluid in ways that made my eyes burn and my vision blur. Collins was doing the same on the other side of the tree, working frantically while the shadow figures watched with alien patience. When the gasoline was gone, I pulled out a road flare and cracked it to life. The red flame seemed pitifully small against the immensity of the tree, but it was all we had. "Collins!" I shouted. "Get back!" I threw the flare at the base of the tree and dove for cover behind a fallen log. Collins was beside me a second later, his face streaked with sweat and dark fluid. The tree went up like a Roman candle. The flames were wrong, just like everything else about the oak. They burned blue and green in colors that don't have names, and they cast shadows that moved independently of the fire. The roar of combustion was mixed with something else, screaming, I realized. The tree was screaming. The shadow figures were screaming too, their forms becoming more solid and more human as the fire spread. I could see faces in them now, faces I recognized from old photographs and missing person reports. People who had disappeared over the years, drawn to the bleeding oak and transformed into its guardians. But the fire wasn't destroying them. If anything, it seemed to be feeding them, making them stronger and more real. They began advancing on our hiding spot with renewed purpose, their movements becoming more coordinated and aggressive. "This isn't working," Collins said, his voice barely audible over the roar of unnatural flames. "We're making it worse." He was right. The fire was spreading beyond the tree, racing through the undergrowth in patterns that defied physics and common sense. But instead of burning the vegetation, it was changing it, transforming ordinary trees and bushes into twisted, bleeding versions of themselves. The infection was spreading. I grabbed Collins by the arm and pulled him toward the path. "We have to get out of here. Warn the town. Evacuate if we have to." But when we reached the edge of the clearing, the path was gone. Where the trail should have been, there was only more forest, stretching away into impossible distances. The fire had somehow severed our connection to the normal world, trapping us in this nightmare realm with the bleeding tree and its guardian shadows. "Sheriff," Collins whispered, "look at your hands." I looked down and felt my heart stop. My hands were covered in the dark fluid, and where it touched my skin, veins were becoming visible beneath the surface. Dark veins that pulsed in rhythm with the breathing sound that filled the air. Collins was in the same state, his face pale with shock as he watched the infection spread up his arms. We were becoming part of it, joining the shadow figures in their eternal vigil around the bleeding oak. "No," I said, though my voice sounded strange in my own ears. "No, this isn't how it ends." But even as I spoke, I could feel the wrongness spreading through my body, changing me from the inside out. My vision was becoming sharper, allowing me to see details in the darkness that human eyes shouldn't be able to perceive. And the copper taste in my mouth was growing stronger, more pleasant, like the finest wine. The shadow figures had stopped advancing. They stood in a loose circle around us, waiting with infinite patience for the transformation to complete itself. One of them, the one who had spoken earlier, approached slowly, its movements now graceful rather than alien. "Welcome," it said, and its voice was almost human now. "Welcome to the garden of the bleeding god. You will tend the roots with us, and feed the dream with your substance, and in time you will understand the beauty of what we serve." I tried to resist, tried to fight against the changes happening in my body and mind, but it was like fighting the tide. The infection was in my blood now, in my bones, rewriting me at a cellular level. Collins had already stopped struggling. He stood beside me with a peaceful expression on his face, his eyes reflecting the weird light of the burning tree. When he looked at me, I could see that he was no longer quite human, but he seemed content with his transformation. "It's not so bad," he said, and his voice had the same wind-through-leaves quality as the shadow figures. "You can see everything now, Sheriff. All the connections, all the patterns. The tree isn't the monster, we are. We've been the monsters all along, poisoning the world with our presence, our pollution, our endless hunger for things that don't belong to us." He was right, I realized. As the infection spread through my consciousness, I could see the truth of it. Humanity was the disease, the cancer that had metastasized across the planet. The bleeding tree was an antibody, a correction, a return to balance. And we were its instruments now. I don't know how long we stood there in the burning clearing, watching our humanity drain away like water through cracked stone. Time seemed to move differently in that place, flowing backward and forward simultaneously. I saw glimpses of the past, the native tribes who had known enough to stay away, the doomed congregation of Jeremiah Blackwood, the countless individuals who had been drawn to the tree over the decades and absorbed into its hungry dreams. And I saw glimpses of the future. Towns like Millbrook withering and dying as the infection spread, their populations transformed into gardeners for an ever-expanding forest of bleeding trees. Cities falling silent as their inhabitants walked calmly into the woods, drawn by dreams of copper and shadow. The world itself slowly returning to a more natural state, cleansed of human ambition and folly. It was beautiful, in its way. When the sun rose, Collins and I walked back into town to begin our work. We had reports to file, lies to tell, evidence to destroy. The tree needed time to spread its influence, to prepare the ground for what was coming. People noticed changes in us, of course. We were paler, quieter, more distant than before. But we explained it as stress from the job, trauma from what we'd seen in the woods. Small-town people are used to their lawmen carrying burdens they can't talk about. The nightmares stopped, but only because the dreamers had become part of the dream. One by one, the people of Millbrook began to change. It started with those who had been exposed to the tree's influence: Sarah Webb, Martha Hendricks, Jimmy Walsh. They grew quiet and contemplative, spending more and more time staring off into the distance, as if they were listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. Then it spread to their families, their friends, their neighbors. The transformation was subtle at first: a tendency to avoid bright lights, a preference for raw meat, an increasing sensitivity to the sounds and smells of the forest. But as the months passed, the changes became more pronounced. The animals returned to the woods, but they were different now. Pale and quiet, with clouded eyes and an unnatural patience. They gathered around the bleeding oak in increasing numbers, adding their bones to the growing patterns when their time came. And always, there was the sound of breathing in the trees, the taste of copper in the air, the sense that something vast and ancient was slowly awakening from a long sleep. I'm telling you this story now because I think my time is running out. The infection has been slow in me, perhaps because of my age or my stubborn nature, but it's winning. I can feel it in my thoughts, my dreams, my gradually changing perceptions of what's normal and what's not. Soon I'll walk into the woods one last time, drawn by dreams of copper and shadow, and I'll take my place among the gardeners who tend the bleeding trees. My bones will join the patterns, my substance will feed the dream, and my voice will join the whisper of wind through leaves. But before I go, I needed to leave this record. Not as a warning. Warnings imply that what's coming can be stopped, and I no longer believe that's true. The bleeding trees are inevitable, a natural correction to an unnatural world. Consider this a confession, then. The final testimony of a man who tried to protect his town and ended up helping to damn it. The story of how the infection spread from one impossible tree to encompass an entire world. Trees don't bleed, I said at the start of this tale. But now they all do. And in their bleeding, the world dreams of a different kind of order, a balance that was lost long ago and is finally being restored. It's a beautiful dream, in its way, even if it means the end of everything we thought we knew about reality. The copper taste is getting stronger now, and I can hear the breathing in the walls of my house. The garden is calling, and its patient gardeners are waiting for me to join them. I think I'll go for a walk in the woods. After all, trees don't bleed. But they dream. And in their dreams, we all find our place. A Sheriff Paranormal Files case. My reflection blinked when I didn't. That was the first sign something had gone sideways in Millbrook, though I wouldn't understand what I'd seen for another 3 days. 3 days of sleepless nights and cold coffee, 3 days of avoiding mirrors like they carried plague, 3 days before I walked into the Henley house and saw what that cracked glass had been trying to show me all along. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what happens when you're 73 and you've got stories rattling around in your skull like dried beans in a mason jar. They want to spill out all at once, but the telling demands order, demands patience. The way things happen matters, especially when those things shouldn't have happened at all. It was a Tuesday in October when Mrs. Carmichael called the station. Not morning, not evening, that dead time in the afternoon when the light starts to yellow and the shadows grow teeth. She'd been walking past the old Henley place on Sycamore Street, same route she'd taken to the post office every Tuesday for 47 years, when she noticed the front door standing open like a mouth waiting to swallow something. The Henley house had been empty for 6 months, ever since old Thomas Henley passed in his sleep. Natural causes, Dr. Morrison said, though Thomas had always been the type to hold on to life with both fists. His nephew from Portland had inherited the place but hadn't bothered to come collect anything more than the deed. Just left it sitting there like a tooth in a skull, windows dark, lawn growing wild with late-season weeds that scratched against the siding when the wind picked up. Mrs. Carmichael was particular about her routines. She noticed when things were out of place, noticed when they weren't the way they ought to be. And that Tuesday, she noticed more than she bargained for. "Sheriff," she said when I picked up the phone, her voice carrying that tight quality folks get when they're trying to convince themselves they didn't see what they saw. "There's someone in the Henley house." I asked her what made her think so. "The door's open and there's movement in the front room. Like someone walking back and forth past the window, but—" She paused, and I heard her take a breath that sounded like it hurt going down. "But I only saw them in the glass. In the window glass. Not in the room itself." That should have been my first real warning, but 47 years of wearing a badge teaches you to hear what people mean instead of what they say. Mrs. Carmichael was 81, lived alone since her husband died, spent too much time watching the neighborhood through her kitchen curtains. Easy enough to dismiss what she'd seen as tricks of light, reflections from passing cars, the way October sun can make shadows dance where they shouldn't. So I drove over to Sycamore Street in my patrol car, taking my time, letting the radio chatter fill the silence. Millbrook was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that sits heavy on a town like dust on old furniture. Even our local troublemakers seemed to be keeping to themselves, as if something had whispered in their ears about minding their own business. The Henley house sat back from the street behind a row of maple trees that had gone red and orange with the season. Pretty enough, I suppose, if you didn't know what I knew about the place. Thomas Henley had lived there alone for 33 years after his wife died, and in all that time, I'd been called to the house exactly 7 times. Never for anything you could put in a report that would make sense to anyone reading it later. Complaints about noises in the walls. Strange smells that came and went. Phone calls in the middle of the night with no one on the other end. Thomas swore his late wife was trying to tell him something, but whatever message she had got lost somewhere between this world and whatever comes after. I'd always figured grief had gotten its hooks in Thomas deeper than most, made him hear things that weren't there, see things that couldn't be. Now, looking at his house with its front door hanging open like a question mark, I wondered if maybe I'd been wrong. The door had been painted white once, but the paint had peeled and faded until it looked more like old bone than anything welcoming. It moved slightly in the breeze, creaking on hinges that needed oil, and every time it swung open a little wider, I caught a glimpse of the hallway beyond. Dark wood floors, wallpaper with roses that looked black in the dim light, and at the far end, the living room where Mrs. Carmichael claimed to have seen her impossible movement. I called out as I approached the porch, identified myself, gave anyone inside plenty of warning that the law was coming to visit. No answer came back except the sound of the door creaking and somewhere inside, a rhythmic tapping like fingernails on wood. The porch boards groaned under my weight. They'd been good lumber once, but time and weather had worked at them until they felt soft underfoot, like they might give way if I put my full weight in the wrong place. I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, not decay or mold like you'd expect in an empty house, but something else. Something that reminded me of the way the air tastes just before lightning strikes, sharp and metallic and wrong. It made the hair on my arms stand up beneath my uniform sleeves. The hallway stretched ahead of me, longer than it should have been in a house that size. On either side, doors stood closed, and I found myself grateful for that small mercy. Something about those doors made me want to keep walking straight ahead, not look too closely at the scratches around their handles or wonder why they seemed to sit crooked in their frames. At the end of the hall, the living room waited. It was an ordinary enough space, or had been once. Hardwood floors polished to a dull shine, built-in bookshelves flanking a brick fireplace, windows that faced the street and let in bars of late afternoon light. Thomas's furniture was gone, carted away by whoever the nephew had hired to clear things out, leaving behind only the pieces too big or worthless to bother with, including the mirror. It hung above the mantelpiece, a massive thing in a frame of dark wood carved with vines and leaves. The glass was old, thick, with that slight waviness that comes from being made by hand instead of machine. And running right down the center, from top to bottom, was a crack like a lightning bolt frozen in time. I'd seen that mirror before, of course. Every time I'd visited Thomas about his complaints, it had been there watching from above the fireplace. But I'd never really looked at it, never noticed how it seemed to catch and hold light in ways that didn't match the rest of the room. Now, standing alone in the empty space, I couldn't look away from it. The crack divided the glass into two unequal halves, and each half reflected something different. The left side showed the room as it was, empty, dusty, filled with the golden light of late afternoon. But the right side showed the room as it had been. I saw Thomas's old recliner in its spot by the window, the afghan his wife had knitted draped over its back. The coffee table sat where it always had, still bearing the ring stains from years of morning cups. Even the bookshelves were full again, packed with the volumes Thomas had collected over a lifetime of reading mysteries and westerns and books about local history. But it was the figure in the chair that made my mouth go dry. She sat with her back to me, just the crown of her gray head visible above the chair's worn fabric. Her hair was pinned up the way women of her generation wore it, neat and proper, and she held something in her lap, knitting, maybe, or needlework. Her hands moved in small, precise motions, the kind that speak of long practice and infinite patience. I knew it was Elizabeth Henley, though she'd been dead for 34 years. I looked away from the mirror, turned to scan the empty room behind me, then looked back. She was still there in the glass, still working at whatever task occupied her hands. Still sitting in a chair that wasn't there anymore, in a room that had been stripped bare months ago. That was when I noticed the tapping sound had stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill its absence felt thick enough to choke on. Even the usual sounds of a house, settling timbers, wind in the eaves, the distant hum of traffic, had gone quiet, as if the world outside had simply stopped while I stood there staring at the impossible. I took a step closer to the mirror, my footsteps echoing on the bare floor, and watched as Elizabeth Henley's head began to turn. She moved slowly, like someone underwater or caught in thick honey, and I found myself holding my breath as more of her profile came into view. I'd seen her photograph in the obituaries years ago, remembered her as a handsome woman with kind eyes and the sort of smile that made you want to trust her with your troubles. The woman in the mirror still had Elizabeth's face, but her eyes. Her eyes were the color of old pennies, tarnished and dark, and they looked at me with an expression I couldn't name. Not anger, not sadness, but something else. Something that made me want to back away from the mirror, turn around, and walk out of that house as fast as my legs would carry me. But I stayed. That was my job, after all, staying when other folks had the good sense to leave. Elizabeth's mouth opened, and though I couldn't hear her voice, I could read her lips well enough. The same word, over and over: help, help, help. Behind her, in the reflected room that existed only in the cracked glass, shadows began to move. They came from corners that should have been empty, sliding along the walls like oil on water, and as they drew closer to Elizabeth's chair, her mouth opened wider in what I knew was a scream I couldn't hear. I reached out without thinking, my hand stopping just short of touching the mirror's surface. The glass was cold enough that I could feel it through the air, cold enough to make my bones ache, and for just a moment I swore I could hear something, voices, maybe, or the sound of breaking glass, or music played backward until it sounded like weeping. Then the shadows in the mirror reached Elizabeth's chair, and both she and the impossible room dissolved like smoke, leaving me staring at my own reflection in cracked glass. Except my reflection was smiling, and I wasn't. I jerked my hand back and stumbled away from the mirror, my heart hammering against my ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. The sound of my breathing filled the empty room, harsh and too loud, and somewhere in the walls around me, that tapping started up again. This time, I recognized the pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. I left the house then, walked straight out the front door and didn't stop until I was standing beside my patrol car with my hands shaking like an old drunk in need of a drink. The October air felt warm as summer after the cold that had surrounded that mirror, and I stood there breathing it in until my hands steadied and my heart remembered how to beat at a normal pace. Mrs. Carmichael was watching from her kitchen window across the street, and when she saw me looking, she raised one hand in a tentative wave. I waved back, got in my car, and drove away without going back inside to close the front door. That night, I called Thomas Henley's nephew in Portland, got his answering machine and left a message about the house being unsecured, suggested he might want to have someone take care of that. What I didn't mention was the mirror, or Elizabeth Henley's impossible presence, or the way my own reflection had smiled at me like it knew something I didn't. Some things don't belong in phone messages. I went home to my empty house. My wife had passed 3 years prior, left me rattling around in rooms that felt too big for one person, and tried to convince myself that what I'd seen was just the product of an old man's imagination running wild in an empty house full of shadows. But every time I passed the mirror that evening, I found myself looking quickly away, afraid of what might be looking back. Wednesday came and went without incident. No calls about the Henley house, no reports of strange occurrences on Sycamore Street. I drove by twice during my patrols, noted that someone had closed the front door, and told myself that was the end of it. I should have known better. Thursday morning brought Dr. Morrison to my office, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past 2 days. Doc was pushing 70 himself, had been taking care of Millbrook's medical needs for longer than I'd been wearing a badge, and I'd never seen him look quite so rattled. "You need to see something," he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful movements of a man whose bones were reminding him of every year he'd lived. "About Thomas Henley." I poured him coffee from the pot I kept going all day, watched him wrap his hands around the mug like he was trying to draw warmth from it. Outside my office window, Millbrook was going about its morning business, folks heading to work, school buses making their rounds, the ordinary rhythm of a small town that had been repeating itself for over a century. "Thomas has been dead 6 months," I reminded him. "That's what I thought too." Doc took a sip of coffee, made a face at the taste, but kept drinking anyway. "Until yesterday, when I was going through some old files. Found something that doesn't make sense." He reached into his jacket, and pulled out a manila folder, the kind doctors use to keep track of their patients' histories. This one was thick, packed with forms and notes, and what looked like decades' worth of accumulated paperwork. Thomas's medical records, he explained, opening the folder on my desk. I keep files on all my patients, even after they pass. Insurance requirements, legal purposes, that sort of thing. But when I was cleaning out my office yesterday, I noticed something odd about Thomas's file. He flipped through pages of handwritten notes, past forms and test results and prescription records, until he reached the most recent entries. The ones from the months leading up to Thomas's death. Look at the dates, he said, pointing to a series of notes written in his careful doctor's handwriting. I looked. The entries were all dated from the past month, weeks after Thomas Henley had supposedly died in his sleep. Office visits, Doc continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 3 of them. Always the same complaint. Said he was having trouble sleeping, kept hearing noises in the walls, kept seeing his wife in mirrors around the house. Said she was trying to tell him something important, but he couldn't make out what she was saying. My coffee suddenly tasted like ashes. You're telling me Thomas Henley came to see you last month? According to my notes, yes. And I remember those visits, Sheriff. I remember them clear as day. He sat right there in my examination room, complained about the cold even though it was warm outside, kept looking over his shoulder like something was following him. I prescribed him sleeping pills, told him grief could play tricks on the mind. Doc closed the folder, met my eyes across the desk. But Thomas Henley died 6 months ago. I signed his death certificate myself. Watched them lower his casket into the ground at Millbrook Cemetery. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of what he'd told me settling between us like a living thing. Outside, the normal sounds of mourning continued, cars passing, children calling to each other, the distant whistle of the freight train that came through town every day at 10:15. Everything normal, everything as it should be, except for the impossible truth of those medical records. There's something else, Doc said eventually. The prescription I wrote for him, the sleeping pills. I called the pharmacy this morning to check if they'd been filled. I waited. They were picked up last Tuesday. Same day Mrs. Carmichael called you about the house. That afternoon, I drove out to Millbrook Cemetery. It sits on a hill overlooking the town, shaded by oak trees that were old when my grandfather was young. The newer sections spread out from the original graveyard like ripples on a pond, each generation of Millbrooks dead claiming their piece of earth in orderly rows marked by granite and marble stones. Thomas Henley's grave was in the newer section, his headstone simple gray granite with his name, dates, and a line from scripture his nephew had chosen. The grass over the grave had grown back in, green and thick, showing no signs of disturbance. But the ground felt wrong under my feet. Not soft, exactly, and not like it had been recently dug. Just different. Like the earth here was older than it should be, colder than the October air could account for. I knelt down and pressed my palm against the grass, felt something that might have been a vibration deep underground, rhythmic and faint. Like a heartbeat. I stayed there until the sun started to sink toward the western hills, watching the headstone for signs of something I couldn't name. But the dead, it seemed, were keeping their secrets for the moment. It wasn't until I was walking back to my car that I heard it, a sound like fingernails tapping on wood, coming from somewhere beneath my feet. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. That night, I went back to the Henley house. I told myself I was just doing my job, checking on a property that had been reported unsecured. But I knew the truth, same as you do. Something's called to you, pull at you like a fish on a line, and you can either go willingly or get dragged. I preferred to walk under my own power. The front door was closed but unlocked. Inside, the house felt different than it had 2 days before, not emptier, but fuller somehow, as if the shadows had grown thicker and more substantial. The smell of pre-storm electricity was stronger now, making my skin prickle and my teeth ache. I made my way down that too-long hallway, past those crooked doors, toward the living room and the mirror that waited above the fireplace. My flashlight beam seemed dimmer than it should be, swallowed up by darkness that felt almost solid. The mirror hung exactly where I'd left it, its cracked surface reflecting my approaching light in jagged fragments. But as I drew closer, I began to see that the crack had changed. It was wider now, the two halves of the glass separating like a wound that wouldn't heal, and through that widening gap, I could see something that made my blood run cold. Another room. Not the living room as it had been, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with walls of old brick and a ceiling lost in shadow, somewhere that smelled of earth and time and things left too long in the dark. And standing in that impossible space, looking directly at me through the cracked glass, was Thomas Henley. He looked exactly as he had in life, tall and spare, with white hair and eyes the color of winter sky. But there was something wrong with his face, something that took me a moment to identify. He was trying to speak, his mouth moving in urgent, desperate motions, but his jaw was wrong. Broken, maybe, or simply not quite connected properly to the rest of his skull. Behind him, barely visible in the gloom of that other place, I could see Elizabeth. She sat in a chair that wasn't quite a chair, her hands moving in those same precise motions I'd seen before. But now I could see what she was working on, not knitting or needlework, but something that looked like cloth but moved like living tissue, something that pulsed and writhed under her fingers as she shaped it into forms I didn't want to recognize. Thomas raised one hand and pressed it against his side of the mirror, his palm flat against the glass. I could see his lips forming words, could almost make out what he was trying to tell me, when the tapping started again. Not from the walls this time. From the mirror itself. The sound came from inside the glass, from that other room where Thomas and Elizabeth waited in their impossible exile. And as the tapping grew louder, more urgent, I began to understand what they were trying to tell me. The crack in the mirror wasn't just a break in the glass. It was a doorway, growing wider with each passing day, letting something through from wherever the dead of Millbrook went when they couldn't quite manage to stay gone. And it was almost wide enough for them to come home. I should have left then. Should have walked out of that house and never looked back, maybe called the state boys and told them Millbrook had a situation that was outside the scope of local law enforcement. But Thomas was pressing both hands against the glass now, his broken face contorted with effort, and I could finally make out what he was trying to say. "Stop her!" I looked past him to where Elizabeth sat working at her impossible task, her fingers flying over material that seemed to shift and change color in the dim light of that other place. As I watched, she lifted her head and looked directly at me, and I saw that her eyes weren't the kind copper I remembered from her obituary photo. They were black. Not dark brown or deep blue, but black like holes burned through paper, like spaces where light went to die. And when she smiled at me, I saw that her teeth had grown sharp. The crack in the mirror widened with a sound like breaking bones. I don't remember running. I don't remember leaving the house or getting in my car or driving back to town. The next thing I knew for certain, I was sitting in my office with the phone in my hand, calling the nephew in Portland at 3 a.m. He answered on the 7th ring, voice thick with sleep and irritation, but he woke up fast when I told him about the mirror and what needed to be done. To his credit, he didn't ask many questions, just said he'd make some calls and take care of it. By noon Friday, a crew from Salem had arrived in Millbrook with a truck full of equipment and instructions to remove one mirror from the Henley house. They wore coveralls and safety goggles and handled that cracked glass like it was radioactive waste. wrapping it in layers of protective material before loading it into a specially constructed crate. I watched from the street as they carried it out, noting how the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as soon as they emerged from the house. One of the workers, a young man with arms like tree trunks and no fear of honest labor, stumbled on the front steps for no reason I could see, and for just a moment I swore I heard the sound of breaking glass. But the mirror was whole when they loaded it into their truck, and it stayed whole as they drove away toward whatever facility had been chosen to contain it. The nephew had been thorough, I'll give him that. Whatever he told those people, it had been enough to get them to treat one broken mirror like it was a piece of nuclear reactor core. That was 6 months ago. The house sold to a young couple from Portland who'd been looking for a quiet place to raise their kids. They painted the walls, refinished the floors, hung their own pictures above the fireplace. Normal people living a normal life in a house that had been set right again. But sometimes, when I'm driving past on my evening patrol, I see them all gathered in the living room looking up at something above the mantel. Looking up and pointing at the bare wall where that mirror used to hang. And sometimes, if the light hits their windows just right, I can see them all smiling. Smiling at something that isn't there anymore. Or maybe something that never really left. My reflection still blinks when I don't, from time to time. Usually happens when I'm not paying attention, when my guard is down and my mind is elsewhere. I'll catch movement from the corner of my eye and turn to see my own face looking back at me from whatever mirror or window or piece of glass happens to be nearby. And sometimes, just sometimes, my reflection waves at me with Thomas Henley's broken hand. I've been thinking about retirement lately. Thinking about selling my house and moving somewhere warm, somewhere the sun shines more often than not, and the shadows don't grow quite so long in the afternoon. Somewhere without so much history buried in the ground, without so many mirrors hanging on the walls. But then I remember Elizabeth Henley sitting in that other place, her black eyes shining and her sharp teeth gleaming as she worked at her impossible task. I remember the way that crack in the mirror had grown wider each time I'd seen it, and I wonder what might have happened if we'd waited another day to have it removed. Some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed. Some reflections never forget what they've seen. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I can still hear tapping in the walls of my house. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, like someone sending a message from very far away. Help, it says. Help. Help. But I'm 73 years old, and my hands shake more than they used to. And I've seen what help can look like when it comes from the wrong place. So I pour myself another cup of coffee, turn the radio up a little louder, and pretend I don't hear anything at all. Because some calls for help are better left unanswered, and some reflections are better left unseen, and some mirrors are better left broken. End of case file. It wasn't marked on any map. And it wasn't meant to be found. But that's the thing about secrets buried deep in small towns like ours. They have a way of working themselves up through the soil, same as tree roots crack concrete or frost heaves buckle the highway each spring. Time has a patience that we don't, and it'll wait decades, even centuries, for the right moment to reveal what was never supposed to see daylight again. I've been sheriff in Millbrook County for 37 years now, and I've seen my share of things that don't fit into neat police reports. Things that make you question whether the world operates by the rules we think it does, or whether those rules are just a thin veneer over something much older and less accommodating. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what we found in Ezekiel Marsh's cornfield that October morning in 1987. The storm had come through 3 nights prior. Not unusual for that time of year, but this one had teeth. Wind strong enough to strip bark from the old oaks along Millbrook Road, rain that came down in sheets so thick you couldn't see the hood of your patrol car. The kind of storm that makes even lifelong locals respect the power of weather. Power lines were down all over the county, and we had flooding in the low areas near Crow Creek that took the better part of a week to recede. Ezekiel called the station on Thursday morning. I remember because it was my birthday, 53 that year, and my wife had packed me a slice of her apple cake for lunch. Deputy Carson took the call. Old Ezekiel's voice on the other end was shaky, which wasn't like him. He'd farmed that land for 40 years, seen every kind of crop damage and soil erosion the county could throw at him. But something in his cornfield had him spooked enough to call the law. "Sheriff needs to come out here," was all Carson could get out of him. "Something ain't right in the north field." I drove out there around noon, taking County Road 19 past the old Methodist cemetery where the headstones lean at angles that seem to shift depending on how the light hits them. The Marsh property sits on a gentle rise about 3 miles past the cemetery, good farmland that's been in his family since before the Civil War. The house is typical of the area, white clapboard green shutters, wide front porch where 3 generations of Marsh men had sat to watch the weather roll in from the west. Ezekiel was waiting for me by his mailbox, still wearing the same oil-stained John Deere cap he'd worn for as long as I'd known him. But there was something different about his posture, the way he kept glancing back toward his north field like he expected something to come walking out of the corn. "It's over here, Sheriff," he said without preamble. "Storm washed out a section near the irrigation ditch. But it ain't the crop damage that's got me bothered." We walked along the muddy tire tracks his tractor had left, through corn that stood 8 feet tall and whispered secrets in a language I didn't understand. The storm had created a natural clearing about 20 feet wide where the water had carved a channel through the field. Stalks lay broken and twisted, their leaves already turning brown at the edges. That's when I saw it. In the center of the washout, where the soil had been scoured away by rushing water, was a trapdoor. Not the remains of one, an actual trapdoor, complete with iron hinges that looked like they'd been oiled yesterday, and a heavy brass handle that gleamed despite being buried God knows how long. The wood was oak, dark with age but solid, fitted with precision that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when things were built to last centuries. "How deep was the soil here before the storm?" I asked. Ezekiel scratched his neck under the cap brim. 3, maybe 4 feet to hardpan. Been farming this section for 20 years, Sheriff. Never saw so much as a fence post hole that wasn't my doing. I knelt beside the door, running my fingers along the edges where it met the surrounding earth. The fit was perfect, as if the ground had grown around it rather than been excavated to accommodate it. There were no signs of recent disturbance, no tool marks or evidence of construction. The door simply existed there, complete and waiting. "You tried to open it?" "Hell no." His voice carried the kind of conviction that comes from deep-rooted superstition. "My grandfather used to tell stories about this land. Said there were things buried here long before his grandfather broke the soil for farming. Old things. Indian things, maybe older than that." I stood, brushing soil from my knees, and studied the surrounding area. The washout had exposed other anomalies, stones arranged in patterns that looked almost deliberate, fragments of what might have been pottery or bone, and a smell that didn't belong. Sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water, but with an underlying mustiness that spoke of deep places and old secrets. "I'm going to need to call the state archaeologist," I said. "Could be Native American artifacts down there." But even as I said it, I knew this wasn't about archaeology. There was something wrong with the air above that trapdoor, a subtle distortion like heat shimmer on summer asphalt, except the day was cool and overcast. When I looked directly at it, my vision seemed to blur slightly at the edges, and I felt a peculiar vertigo, as if I were standing at the edge of a cliff instead of on level ground. Ezekiel seemed to sense my unease. My grandfather said this whole area used to be different. Before the town, before the farms. Said there was a settlement here once, people who weren't quite people. They had their own ways, their own purposes. I'd heard similar stories from other old-timers in the county. Vague references to the time before white settlement, when the land held different meanings and the boundaries between worlds weren't as clearly defined. Most of it was folklore, the kind of tales that grow in rural communities like moss on north-facing stones. But standing there above that impossible trapdoor, the stories felt less like folklore and more like warnings. The first thing I did was secure the scene. Yellow tape, though I doubted anyone would wander onto Ezekiel's property uninvited. Then I called Dr. Sarah Morrison at the State University. She'd worked on several archaeological sites in the county and had a reputation for thoroughness and discretion. She arrived the next morning with 2 graduate students and enough equipment to excavate a Roman villa. But after 6 hours of careful work around the trapdoor, she looked as puzzled as I felt. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted, pulling off her work gloves. "The door appears to be 19th century construction, but it's sitting on top of soil layers that date back at least 300 years. There's no evidence of excavation, no disturbance in the surrounding strata. It's as if it was placed there before the soil formed around it. Could it have sunk over time?" She shook her head. "The weight distribution is all wrong. And look at this." She showed me a core sample taken from directly beneath the door. "We should be hitting clay or bedrock at this depth, but the soil just continues. It's as if the ground goes down much deeper than it should." By evening, the graduate students had finished their preliminary mapping and photography. The trapdoor measured exactly 4 feet by 4 feet, with hinges that showed no signs of rust despite obvious age. The brass handle was engraved with symbols that Dr. Morrison couldn't identify. Not Native American, not colonial European, nothing in her extensive reference materials. "We need to open it," she said as we stood in the fading light, the cornfield around us rustling with movements that had nothing to do with wind. I should have said no. Should have told her to pack up her equipment and file whatever report satisfied the state bureaucracy. Should have trusted the instinct that had kept me alive through 3 decades of law enforcement in a county where people still disappeared without explanation and where certain roads were best avoided after dark. Instead, I nodded. We scheduled the opening for the following afternoon, giving Dr. Morrison time to arrange for additional documentation and safety equipment. She insisted on treating it as a potential confined space entry, complete with air quality monitoring and rope systems in case the opening led to some kind of underground chamber. But that night, things began to change. I was awakened at 2:17 a.m. by my phone ringing. The caller ID showed Ezekiel's number. "Sheriff, you need to get out here. Something's happening in the field." I could hear it in the background before he explained. A low humming sound, barely audible but somehow profound, like the vibration of a massive tuning fork struck somewhere deep underground. It seemed to pulse with a rhythm that was almost, but not quite, like a heartbeat. I threw on my clothes and drove out through darkness so complete it felt solid. The sound was audible even inside my patrol car as I turned into Ezekiel's drive, a subsonic thrumming that seemed to come from the ground itself. Every dog in the area was howling. Ezekiel met me at the door, fully dressed despite the hour. "Started about 20 minutes ago," he said. "And there's something else." We walked to the edge of the north field, flashlight beams cutting through air that felt thick and somehow resistant. The humming grew stronger as we approached the washout, and I began to notice other changes. The broken cornstalks around the trapdoor had begun to right themselves, their broken stems somehow healing and reaching skyward despite lacking roots. The sweet, cloying smell was stronger, accompanied now by something that reminded me of ozone after lightning strikes. But it was the light that made me question my sanity. The trapdoor was glowing. Not brightly, more like moonlight filtering through clouds, but with a steady, cool radiance that seemed to emanate from the wood itself. The brass handle pulsed in rhythm with the humming, cycling from dull bronze to brilliant gold, and back again. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "Don't think he's got much to do with this," Ezekiel replied. We stood there for perhaps 20 minutes, watching the impossible display. The light gradually faded as the humming decreased in intensity, finally disappearing entirely as the first gray hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon. By full daylight, the trapdoor looked normal again, ancient and mysterious, but no longer actively defying the laws of physics. Dr. Morrison arrived with her team at 3 o'clock, along with additional equipment borrowed from the university's geology department. She'd also brought a colleague, Dr. James Whitmore, who specialized in what he diplomatically called anomalous archaeological phenomena. I described the previous night's events while they set up their instruments. Dr. Whitmore listened without comment, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal that looked older than the trapdoor itself. "We've encountered similar manifestations at 3 other sites," he said when I finished. "Always in rural areas, always associated with pre-colonial activity. The working theory is that certain locations served as interfaces between our world and spaces that operate by different physical laws." "You mean like doors to other dimensions?" He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "That's the Hollywood version. The reality is probably more mundane and more terrifying. Think of it as a place where the normal rules become flexible, where the boundary between what is and what might be becomes permeable." The air quality readings came back normal, though Dr. Morrison noted unusual electromagnetic fluctuations in the immediate area around the trapdoor. The ground-penetrating radar painted a confusing picture. The space beneath the door showed as both solid earth and empty void, depending on the frequency used. "Let's proceed," Dr. Whitmore said. "But slowly, and with full documentation of every step." I should have stopped them then. Should have cited safety concerns or jurisdictional issues or any of a dozen valid reasons to postpone the opening indefinitely. But curiosity is a powerful force, and I'd spent 3 sleepless nights wondering what lay beneath that impossible door. Dr. Morrison attached a rope to the brass handle, allowing her to lift it from a safe distance. The hinges moved smoothly, silently, despite their apparent age. As the door swung open, a breath of air emerged from the opening, cool and somehow old, carrying scents of deep earth and distant places. The opening revealed stairs. Not a pit or a cellar or a storm shelter, but carefully constructed stone steps leading down into darkness. The stonework was unlike anything I'd seen in the county. Smooth blocks fitted so precisely that no mortar was visible, carved with the same unidentifiable symbols that marked the brass handle. Dr. Whitmore lowered a high-powered light on a cable. The beam revealed perhaps 20 steps before the stairway curved out of sight. The walls were the same smooth stone, and the air currents suggested significant space below. "The construction predates any known settlement in this area by centuries," Dr. Morrison said, studying the stonework through binoculars. "The techniques are sophisticated, but they don't match any regional architectural traditions." "So who built it?" I asked. Dr. Whitmore was silent for a long moment. "Perhaps the better question is when. Time doesn't seem to function normally in places like this. The construction could be ancient, or it might not have been built yet." I stared at him. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means we're dealing with a phenomenon that exists outside our normal understanding of causality. The stairs might lead to a place that was, or will be, or never was at all." Despite my growing unease, I found myself volunteering to descend first. It was my jurisdiction, my responsibility, and if there were answers to be found, I needed to find them. Dr. Whitmore insisted on full safety protocols, radio contact, emergency retrieval systems, and a maximum descent of 50 feet before we reassessed the situation. The stone steps were solid beneath my boots, worn smooth by countless passages. The walls curved gently to the left as I descended, following what seemed to be a spiral pattern. My flashlight beam revealed no end to the stairway, just more smooth stone disappearing into deeper darkness. At 30 feet down, I encountered the first anomaly. The air temperature, which had been steadily cooling during my descent, suddenly warmed. Not gradually. Between one step and the next, it went from perhaps 50 degrees to a comfortable 70. There was no logical explanation for the change. At 40 feet, I heard voices. Not from above, where Dr. Morrison and her team waited, but from below. Faint conversations in a language I didn't recognize, accompanied by sounds that might have been footsteps on stone. I called up to report the phenomenon, and Dr. Morrison's voice crackled back through the radio with concern clearly audible. "Sheriff, we're not detecting any other heat signatures or electromagnetic activity down there. Are you certain about the voices?" I listened carefully. The sounds continued, definitely human voices, definitely coming from deeper in the stairway. But when I described what I was hearing, Dr. Whitmore's response chilled me. "Sheriff, I need you to come back up immediately. Those voices, they might not be coming from below. They might be coming from when?" I started to ask what he meant, but the radio chose that moment to dissolve into static. The voices below grew clearer, and I began to make out individual words, though in no language I recognized. The tone was conversational, almost casual, as if I were overhearing neighbors discussing the weather. At 50 feet I reached a landing. The stairway opened onto a circular chamber perhaps 20 feet across, with passages leading off in 4 directions. The stonework here was even more elaborate, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow when I wasn't looking directly at them. The walls were lit by some kind of phosphorescent moss or lichen, providing a soft, greenish illumination that made everything look underwater. And there were footprints in the dust. Not old prints, fresh ones, made by boots very similar to my own. They led across the chamber and disappeared down one of the passages. But according to Dr. Morrison's instruments, I was the first person to enter this space in centuries. I followed the footprints. The passage sloped gently downward, continuing the spiral pattern. The walls here were covered with symbols and pictographs that definitely weren't Native American. Some depicted human figures engaged in activities I couldn't identify, while others showed geometric patterns that hurt to look at for too long. The phosphorescent growth was thicker here, providing enough light to see clearly. The footprints led me to another chamber, this one much larger. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls, and when I dropped a coin to test the acoustic properties, I never heard it hit bottom. The footprints continued across what appeared to be a bridge, a narrow span of the same smooth stone, arching over whatever lay in the darkness below. Halfway across the bridge, I realized I could see light ahead. Not artificial light, but daylight. Natural sunlight streaming down from above, as if there were an opening to the surface. But that was impossible. According to my calculations, I was at least 100 feet underground and had been traveling in a spiral that should have brought me back toward the original entrance. The light grew stronger as I approached the far end of the bridge. I could make out details now: trees, grass, what looked like a gravel path winding through a park or garden. The temperature continued to rise, and I began to smell flowers, fresh air, and something else. Something that reminded me of my childhood, though I couldn't place what it was. I reached the end of the passage and found myself looking up a short flight of steps toward an opening that framed a view of impossible beauty. Rolling hills covered with grass so green it almost hurt to look at, trees that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light, and a sky the color of robins' eggs. The air smelled of spring mornings and fresh possibilities. But it was the sound that made me stop. Children laughing. Not the voices I'd heard on the stairs, but the unmistakable sound of children at play. Happy children, running and calling to each other in that universal language of joy that transcends culture and time. I climbed the steps. The opening led to a hilltop overlooking a valley that couldn't exist. Not in Millbrook County, not anywhere in Ohio, probably not anywhere on Earth. The landscape below was pastoral perfection, a small town with white houses and church spires, surrounded by farmland that belonged in a painting rather than reality. Smoke rose from chimneys, and I could see people moving along the streets, going about their daily business. And there were children playing in a park near the center of town. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching a place that shouldn't exist beneath a cornfield in rural Ohio. The sun was warm on my face, and a gentle breeze carried scents of baking bread and wood smoke. It was the most peaceful place I'd ever seen, and I found myself wanting to walk down into that valley, to join the people in their perfect little town. That's when I noticed the footprints again. They led from where I stood down the hill toward the town. But they weren't alone. There were other tracks now, dozens of them, made by different boots and shoes. Some looked fresh, while others were partially obscured by grass and weather. All led in the same direction, toward the town in the valley. None led back. I followed the newest tracks for perhaps 50 yards before I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One set of prints had been made by boots I recognized, regulation police boots, identical to the ones I was wearing. They were accompanied by tracks made by hiking boots and work shoes, the kind worn by Dr. Morrison's archaeological team. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Somewhere, somewhen, another version of this investigation had taken place. Other people had found the trapdoor, explored the passages, and emerged into this impossible landscape. And they had walked down into that perfect valley and never returned. I turned and ran. Back through the passages, across the bridge over the darkness, up the spiral stairway toward the surface. Behind me, the voices called out in languages I didn't understand, and I could swear I heard footsteps following. The temperature dropped as I climbed, and the phosphorescent glow faded until I was running through darkness broken only by my failing flashlight. I emerged from the trapdoor gasping and shaking, collapsing onto the muddy ground beside Ezekiel's washout. Dr. Morrison and her team rushed to help me, their faces showing the concern of people who'd been waiting much longer than the hour I thought I'd been gone. "Sheriff, you've been down there for 6 hours," Dr. Morrison said. "We were preparing a rescue operation." 6 hours. It had felt like 2 at most. I told them what I'd seen, leaving out nothing despite how insane it sounded. Dr. Whitmore listened with the intensity of a man hearing confirmation of his worst fears. "We're closing this site," he said when I finished. "Permanently. What about the archaeological significance? Some things are more important than knowledge. This is clearly an active temporal anomaly, possibly a threshold between parallel realities. The fact that you encountered evidence of your own future investigation suggests a causal loop that could have catastrophic implications. We sealed the trapdoor with concrete and steel, though I suspected it wouldn't matter. Places like this have their own agenda, and they don't stay buried long once they decide to reveal themselves. Ezekiel sold the farm 6 months later and moved to Florida, claiming the land was cursed. The new owners planted soybeans instead of corn and never reported any unusual phenomena. But I know it's still there, waiting beneath the concrete and steel, dreaming its patient dreams. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is from the west, I can still hear children laughing in a place that never was. And I wonder how many other versions of myself have stood at the edge of that perfect valley, watching footprints lead down into paradise and never return. The strangest part isn't what I found beneath Ezekiel's cornfield. The strangest part is that I've started having dreams about a hilltop overlooking a valley that couldn't exist. Dreams where I can smell baking bread and hear children playing. Dreams where I walk down a gravel path toward a perfect little town where the sun always shines and no one ever grows old. Dreams where I don't turn back. It wasn't marked on any map. And it wasn't meant to be found. But now it's found me, and sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder if that was the point all along. If that impossible place beneath the cornfield was never really a door to elsewhere, but a trap designed to catch people exactly like me. People curious enough to look beyond the surface, stubborn enough to keep digging, foolish enough to think they could walk into mystery and walk back out unchanged. 35 years have passed since that October morning in Ezekiel's field. I'm retired now, my deputy days long behind me, my memory growing soft around the edges like an old photograph. But I remember every detail of that place beneath the trapdoor, every stone and shadow and impossible vista. And sometimes, when the dreams become too vivid and the longing too strong, I drive out past the old Methodist cemetery and park on the shoulder of County Road 19. I walk to where Ezekiel's cornfield used to be, now planted with soybeans that whispered different secrets in the wind. I stand above the place where concrete and steel supposedly seal away something that was never meant to be found. And I listen for children laughing in a town that never was, wondering if this time I'll have the courage to answer when they call my name. The earth opened up and started calling folks by name. That's how I remember it starting, anyway. Been 37 years since I pinned on this badge, and I've seen plenty that would make most people question their sanity. But what happened during that scorching July in '94 still sits heavy in my chest like a stone someone forgot to pull out. Millbrook's always been the kind of place where nothing much happens and folks like it that way. Population hovering just under 3,000, nestled between rolling hills that seem to watch you drive through. The kind of town where everybody knows everybody, where the hardware store's been run by the same family for 4 generations, and where the cemetery's older than most of the living residents can remember. It was Mrs. Henderson from the post office who first mentioned the hole. She'd been out walking her beagle along the old county road that traces the town's eastern edge, where the pavement gives way to packed dirt and the houses thin out to nothing but scraggly pines and yellow grass. Said she nearly stepped right into it, would have too if the dog hadn't started whining and pulling back on the leash. Wasn't there yesterday, she told me, standing in my office with her purse clutched tight against her floral dress. I walk Buster the same route every morning, Sheriff. Been doing it for 12 years. That hole just appeared. I figured it for a sinkhole. We get them sometimes, especially after heavy rains, though we hadn't seen much precipitation that summer. The drought had been particularly cruel, leaving the ground hard as concrete and the local farmers nervous. But sinkholes happen. Ground shifts, water finds new ways to flow, and sometimes the earth just decides to swallow a piece of itself. The hole was about 6 feet across, perfectly round, with edges so clean they looked machine-cut. Standing at the rim, you couldn't see the bottom. Just darkness that seemed to go down forever. The morning sun was bright and harsh, but it didn't penetrate more than a few feet into that opening. It was like the earth had developed a mouth and was keeping it slightly ajar. I dropped a rock down there. Never heard it hit. That should have been my first real warning, but you get complacent in a job like mine. 37 years of drunk and disorderlies, domestic disputes, and the occasional break-in makes you think you've seen everything worth seeing. The supernatural stuff, if it exists at all, happens in other places to other people. Not in Millbrook. Not on my watch. The smell hit me as I was walking back to the patrol car. Sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in standing water. But there weren't any flowers nearby, just the parched grass and a few stunted oak trees that looked like they were slowly dying of thirst. I turned back toward the hole, and the smell faded. Another step away, and it was gone entirely. I put up some orange cones and yellow tape, thinking I'd call the county about getting someone out to look at it. Maybe fill it in before some kid fell down there and never came back up. But you know how these things go. Counties always got more pressing matters, and one sinkhole in the middle of nowhere doesn't exactly constitute an emergency. By the next morning, word had spread the way it does in small towns. Folks were driving out to take a look. Not many, mind you. Millbrook's not the type of place where people get excited about much of anything. But enough. Enough to make me wish I'd posted a deputy out there instead of just some traffic cones that any fool could move aside. That's when the story started. Jimmy Kowalski, who runs the gas station on Main Street, told me he'd driven out there with his wife. Said they'd both heard something when they got close to the edge. Like someone calling from way down deep, is how he put it. Sounded like my name, but all stretched out and hollow. His wife nodded along, her face pale as milk. Heard mine too. Clear as anything. Made my skin crawl. I might have dismissed it as imagination. People hear what they expect to hear, especially when they're already spooked. But then came Mrs. Patterson, who taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church and had never told a lie in her 73 years. She'd walked out there with her sister-in-law, a practical woman who sold insurance and had no patience for nonsense. We both heard our names, Mrs. Patterson said, and something in her voice made the hair on my arms stand up. Not together, mind you. One at a time. Mine first, then Helen's. Like whatever was down there was taking turns. Helen nodded, her usual stern expression replaced by something I'd never seen before. Fear, maybe? Or recognition of something that shouldn't exist. Wasn't the wind, she added quietly. Wasn't anything natural at all. By the third day, I'd heard the same story from 6 different people. All claimed they'd heard their names whispered from the depths of that hole. All described the same thing, voices that sounded familiar yet wrong, like hearing yourself on a recording played back at the wrong speed. I should have closed off the area entirely. Should have put a deputy out there around the clock. But curiosity's a dangerous thing, and after 37 years of dealing with the mundane realities of small-town law enforcement, part of me wanted to experience something genuinely unexplainable. So I went back out there alone, just as the sun was setting and the air was finally starting to cool. The hole looked different in the evening light, darker, somehow, and more defined. The edges seemed sharper, more deliberate. Standing at the rim, I could feel a slight breeze coming up from below, carrying that same sickly sweet smell I'd noticed before. I waited. Listened. The cicadas were singing in the distance, and somewhere an owl was calling. Normal summer evening sounds in a normal place that was becoming anything but normal. Then I heard it. Samuel. My given name, stretched out like taffy and delivered in a voice that sounded like mine but wasn't. It came from so far down that it seemed to originate from the earth's core, yet it was clear enough that I could make out every syllable. I stepped back from the edge, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But even as every instinct told me to get back in the car and drive away, I found myself leaning forward again, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. Samuel. This time it was clearer, more insistent. And underneath it, so faint I might have imagined it, I thought I heard other voices. A dozen, maybe more, all calling different names in that same hollow, stretched out cadence. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Sat in my kitchen with a glass of whiskey and tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Heat exhaustion, maybe? Or stress. 37 years of this job could play tricks on a man's mind. But I knew what I'd heard. The next morning brought Deputy Collins to my office with the report that made my blood run cold. 3 people had been reported missing overnight. A traveling salesman who'd been passing through town, a teenager from the next county over who'd been visiting friends, and old Pete Morrison, who lived alone in a trailer on the south side and didn't have family to speak of. All 3 had last been seen heading toward the east side of town, toward the hole. I found their cars parked along the county road, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignitions. No signs of struggle. No evidence of foul play. Just 3 empty vehicles sitting in the morning sun like abandoned shells. The hole itself had changed. Not bigger exactly, but deeper. More present. It seemed to pull at your attention even when you weren't looking directly at it, like a stain on the corner of your vision that wouldn't go away. And the smell was stronger now. Not just sweet and cloying, but with an undertone of something else. Something organic and old and wrong. I called the state police. Called the FBI. Called everyone I could think of who might have jurisdiction or expertise or just the authority to take this thing off my hands. But bureaucracy moves slow, and by the time any one official arrived, 5 more people had vanished. The pattern was always the same. Folks would drive out to look at the hole, park their cars along the road, and simply disappear. No screams. No signs of struggle. One minute they were there, the next they weren't. But the hole remembered them. If you got close enough to the edge and listened carefully, you could hear their voices mixed in with whatever was calling from below. Faint and distant, but unmistakably human. Calling names. Always calling names. The state boys arrived on a Thursday, full of theories about serial killers and drug cartels and all the rational explanations that people cling to when faced with the impossible. They set up a perimeter, brought in dogs, took measurements and soil samples and photographs. The dogs wouldn't go near the hole. Every single one of them would get within about 10 feet and then start whining and pulling back toward the cars, hackles raised and tails tucked. The crime scene photographer's camera malfunctioned every time he tried to get a shot directly down into the opening. The soil samples came back inconclusive, normal earth, nothing unusual about the composition or structure. But the voices were getting louder. By the end of the week, you could hear them from 20 feet away. A constant whisper of names rising from the depths like steam from a pot. The names of the missing, mostly, but other names too. Names of people who'd lived in Millbrook decades ago. Names from the old cemetery records. Names that shouldn't have been known to anyone still alive. The FBI brought in specialists. Geologists who declared the hole a natural phenomenon, despite being unable to determine its depth or explain its perfect circular shape. Psychologists who suggested mass hysteria, despite the physical evidence of the missing persons. Audio experts who recorded hours of the whispers but could never quite isolate individual voices when they played the recordings back. Everyone had theories. Nobody had answers. The breakthrough, if you could call it that, came from the most unlikely source. Mrs. Henley, the town librarian, had been researching local history, trying to find any mention of similar phenomena in the old records. What she found was a journal entry from 1847, written by one of Millbrook's founding families. "The calling ground opened again today," the entry read. "Third time in my lifetime. Pa says it happens every 40-50 years, when the earth gets restless. Says the old ones who lived here before us knew to stay away when it opened. Says they had names for it in their tongue, words that meant the place where voices live or the mouth that swallows names. Says it'll close when it's had its fill, but not before. Says we just have to wait it out, like our grandfathers did. 47 years. That's how long it had been since the last recorded disappearances in Millbrook. A cluster of missing persons in 1947 that had never been solved. People who'd simply vanished without a trace over the course of a few weeks. The official records were sparse, but the pattern was the same. Cars found abandoned. No signs of struggle. No bodies ever recovered. And 43 years before that, another cluster. And 48 years before that, going back as far as the records existed. The hole wasn't a sinkhole. It was something else entirely. Something cyclical. Something that opened when it needed to feed and closed when it was satisfied. By the time we'd pieced together the pattern, 14 people had disappeared. The whispers from below had become a constant murmur, like a crowd of people all trying to talk at once. You could hear them from a quarter-mile away on a quiet night, a sound that made dogs howl and sent birds flying from their roosts. The federal authorities were getting desperate. They'd brought in heavy equipment, talking about filling the hole with concrete or sealing it somehow. But every piece of machinery they tried to position near the opening would malfunction. Engines would die. Hydraulics would fail. Electronics would fritz out. It was as if the hole had developed an immune system, rejecting any attempt to interfere with its purpose. That's when I made my decision. I'd been sheriff of this town for 37 years. I'd sworn an oath to protect its people, and I'd failed. 14 souls had been lost on my watch, swallowed by something I couldn't understand or fight. But there was one thing I could do, one way to maybe tip the balance. I waited until the federal team was back at their motel for the night, then drove out to the hole alone. The whispers were so loud now they were almost musical, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My name was in there somewhere, I was sure of it. Had been for days, maybe weeks. Just waiting for me to get close enough to hear it clearly. I parked the patrol car and walked to the edge. The hole seemed bigger now, though the measurements said it hadn't changed. Deeper, certainly. The darkness below was absolute, a black so complete it seemed solid. The voices reached out to me like invisible hands. "Samuel," they called, and this time I heard it clearly. My voice, but not my voice. The voice I might have had if I'd been born in the depths of the earth instead of under the open sky. I understood then what the old journal had meant about the earth getting restless, about cycles and hunger, and things that lived in the spaces between spaces. This wasn't evil, exactly. It was just nature operating on a scale too large for human comprehension. A predator so ancient and alien that we couldn't even properly recognize it as such. But understanding didn't make me brave. I stood at that edge for what felt like hours, listening to my name called over and over in increasingly urgent tones. The voices of the missing joined in, a chorus of my friends and neighbors begging me to come down and join them in whatever existence they'd found in the dark. I almost did it. Almost stepped forward and let myself fall into that perfect circle of nothingness. It would have been so easy. And maybe it would have been enough to satisfy whatever hungered below, to end the cycle and save whoever might have been next. But I was a coward. When the sun started to rise and the voices began to fade with the light, I stepped back from the edge and walked to my car. The hole closed 3 days later. Not gradually, but all at once, like a wound healing in fast forward. The earth simply folded in on itself, leaving nothing but a slight depression in the ground and a lingering smell of old flowers. The federal team packed up and left, their reports filed and forgotten. The missing persons cases were officially closed as unsolved, which is the bureaucratic way of saying we give up. Life in Millbrook returned to normal, or what passes for normal in a place where 14 people can vanish without a trace and everyone just agrees not to talk about it. But I remember. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I think I can still hear them. Faint and far away, but there. The voices of my neighbors and friends, calling names from somewhere deep beneath our feet. Waiting, maybe, for the next time the earth gets restless and decides it's hungry again. The mathematics are simple enough. 47 years since the last time, and it's been 30 years since this one closed. Which means, if the pattern holds, I've got about 17 years left to figure out what to do when it opens again. 17 years to decide whether I'll be brave enough to step forward next time, or if I'll just stand at the edge again and listen to the earth call my name, while other people pay the price for my cowardice. 17 years to live with the knowledge that some hungers are older than human civilization, and some cycles can't be broken by badges or good intentions or federal task forces. The earth opened up and started calling folks by name. And when it was done, it closed again and left the rest of us to pretend it never happened at all. But I know better. In 17 years, give or take, it'll open again. And maybe next time, I'll be ready to answer when it calls. Or maybe I'll just be another old man standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, too frightened to step forward and too guilty to step back. Either way, Millbrook will endure. It always has. Some towns are built on solid ground, others on shifting sand. But this place, I've come to understand, is built on something else entirely. Something that whispers names in the dark and counts the years between meals. Something that knows exactly who we are, even when we're not sure ourselves. The earth remembers everything. And sometimes, when it gets restless, it likes to remind us that we're not nearly as permanent as we'd like to believe. I woke up last night with mud on my boots and no idea why. Been 43 years since I pinned on this badge in Millbrook County, and I've seen enough to know when something ain't sitting right. The mud was black clay, the kind that only comes from down by the old cemetery where the water table runs high. Problem is, I hadn't been near that place in months. Not since we had to dig up those 3 graves that kept sinking. But there it was, caked thick on my work boots, sitting right there beside my bed like evidence I couldn't explain away. That was 3 weeks ago, and I'm only talking about it now because what happened after makes a man question everything he thought he knew about the world. See, I've been sheriff of this county since 1981, and in all that time, I learned to trust what I could see, what I could touch, what made sense. But some things don't make sense, and some things don't want to be understood. Millbrook's one of those places that time forgot to visit regular. Population holds steady around 800 souls, give or take whoever decides they've had enough of small-town life and moves on to bigger things. We got one main street, 2 churches, a diner that serves coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and secrets that run deeper than the old coal mines that honeycombed the hills around us decades back. The town sits in a valley, surrounded by ridges covered in oak and maple, with Sugar Creek running right through the middle. Beautiful country, if you like your beauty with a little melancholy mixed in. Problem is, beauty sometimes hides ugly things, and Millbrook's got its share of both. I started noticing the pattern about a year ago, though I didn't call it a pattern then. Just thought it was coincidence. Mrs. Henderson from over on Elm Street mentioned she'd been sleepwalking again, something she hadn't done since she was a child. Found herself standing in her garden at 3 in the morning, nightgown covered in dirt, with no memory of how she got there. Then it was old Pete Ramirez, who runs the hardware store. His wife found him missing from bed one night, discovered him 2 hours later sitting on their back porch, mud caked between his toes, staring off toward the hills like he was waiting for something. Each time, they'd wake up confused, disoriented, with that black clay mud somewhere on them or their clothes. Each time, they swore they never sleepwalked before in their lives. And each time, when I checked my calendar later, I found it had happened on the night of a blood moon. Now, I'm not what you'd call a superstitious man. Grew up Methodist, still attend services when my old bones allow it, and I've always figured there's a logical explanation for most everything if you dig deep enough. But when the same impossible thing keeps happening to different people on the same type of night, a man starts to wonder if maybe logic ain't the only tool in the shed. The first time I really paid attention was when it happened to young Sarah Chin, who moved here from the city about 2 years back to teach at our elementary school. Sweet girl, sensible, the kind who double-checks her doors are locked and keeps her car keys in the same spot every night. Not the sleepwalking type, if there is such a thing. Her landlord, Jim Morrison, called me on a Tuesday morning, voice shaky in a way that told me this wasn't about a parking ticket or a noise complaint. "Sheriff, you need to come over to the Chin place. Something ain't right." Found Sarah sitting on her front steps, still in her pajamas, looking like she'd been dragged through a bramble patch. Her feet were black with that familiar clay mud, and there were leaves caught in her hair. But it was her eyes that got to me, wide and unfocused, like she was trying to remember a dream that kept slipping away every time she almost grasped it. "I don't understand," she kept saying, over and over. "I don't understand where I was." Jim had found her there at dawn, when he came by to fix a loose board on her porch steps. She'd been sitting exactly like that for who knows how long, staring toward the cemetery hill with that 1,000-yard stare soldiers get after they've seen too much combat. The night before had been a blood moon, perfect and rust-colored, hanging low over our valley like a warning nobody wanted to read. I helped Sarah inside, made her some coffee, and tried to piece together what had happened. Far as she could remember, she'd gone to bed around 10:30, same as always. Next thing she knew, she was sitting on those steps with the sun creeping over the ridge, and no idea how she'd gotten there. But here's the thing that really stuck with me. When I asked her if she remembered dreaming, her whole body went rigid. Not scared exactly, but like someone had just walked over her grave. "I remember walking," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Walking with others. But I can't see their faces, and I can't remember where we were going." I filed a report, though what I wrote down was sanitized enough to not raise eyebrows. Possible sleepwalking incident. Subject found disoriented but unharmed. Didn't mention the mud, or the look in her eyes, or the way she kept checking the locks on her doors for weeks afterward. That should have been the end of it. People sleepwalk, even grown adults. Maybe the blood moon was just coincidence. Maybe the mud was from her backyard. Maybe I was looking for patterns where none existed. But then it happened again. This time it was 3 people on the same night: Dr. Reeves from the medical clinic, Tom Bradley who runs the post office, and Maria Santos from the grocery store. All found the same way, all covered in that black clay mud, all with the same confused, haunted expression. And all of them remembered walking. Walking together, though none of them could recall seeing the others. Walking towards something important, though they couldn't say what. Walking like they had somewhere they needed to be, though they had no idea where. I started keeping a moon calendar after that, marking the dates of every blood moon for the next 2 years. Started checking on people the mornings after, making casual rounds through town, seeing who looked tired or confused or like they'd been somewhere they couldn't remember. The pattern held. Every blood moon, without fail, I'd find at least 2 or 3 people who'd had the same experience. Always the mud, always the walking, always that lost, dreamy expression like they were trying to remember something just beyond reach. But here's what really started eating at me. I began to notice that some folks were getting better at remembering. Not the details, but the feeling. The sense that whatever they'd been doing, wherever they'd been going, it was important. Necessary even. Mrs. Henderson started leaving her back door unlocked on blood moon nights. Just in case, she said when I asked her about it, though she couldn't explain in case of what. Pete Ramirez mentioned that he'd started going to bed fully clothed on those nights, boots by the bed, like part of him knew he'd be needing them. And Sarah Chin, sweet, logical Sarah Chin, admitted to me one afternoon that she'd started looking forward to the blood moons. Not looking forward to the confusion or the lost time, but to the walking itself. To whatever it was that called to her in her sleep. It feels like going home, she said, and the way she said it made my skin crawl. Even though I don't know where home is. That's when I decided I needed to see for myself what happened on a blood moon night in Millbrook. The next one was scheduled for October 15th, and I made plans to stay awake, to watch, to finally get some answers. I positioned myself on the hill overlooking Main Street, with a clear view of most of the residential area. Had my thermos of coffee, my binoculars, and a camera with a telephoto lens. If people were sleepwalking, I was going to document it. If something else was going on, well, I figured I'd cross that bridge when I came to it. The blood moon rose around midnight, casting everything in that rusty, unnatural light that makes familiar places look alien. I settled in to wait, watching the houses below for any sign of movement. I didn't have to wait long. Around 12:30, I saw the first door open. Mrs. Henderson's back door, just like she'd been leaving it unlocked. She emerged in her nightgown, moving with a slow, steady pace that didn't look quite natural. Not the shuffling gait of a confused sleepwalker, but purposeful. Directed. Then came Pete Ramirez, fully dressed just like he'd said, walking out his front door and down the street without any hesitation. No looking around, no confusion, just walking like he knew exactly where he was going. One by one, doors opened throughout the town. People emerged from their houses, all moving in the same general direction, toward the old cemetery hill where I'd been finding that black clay mud. I counted at least 15 people in that strange procession, maybe more. All walking with that same purposeful stride, all heading toward the same destination. And in the red light of the blood moon, they looked less like sleepwalkers and more like pilgrims. That's when I made my mistake. Instead of staying put and observing, I decided to follow them. Curiosity killed the cat, as they say, and it damn near killed this old sheriff too. I made my way down the hill, keeping to the shadows, following the slow-moving group as they walked through town and up the winding path toward Millbrook Cemetery. The older part of the cemetery, where the headstones date back to the 1800s and the ground stays soft even in dry weather. They moved between the graves with perfect certainty, never stumbling, never hesitating, like they could see better in the blood moon light than they ever could in daylight. And maybe they could. Maybe whatever was calling to them gave them senses the rest of us don't have. They gathered in a circle around something I couldn't quite make out from my position behind the old Hartley mausoleum. I crept closer, trying to get a better view, trying to understand what I was witnessing. That's when I saw the hole. Right in the center of their circle was a hole in the ground, maybe 4 feet across, perfectly round, going down deeper than my flashlight beam could reach. The earth around it was that same black clay mud I'd been finding on everyone's shoes and clothes. But here's the thing that made my blood turn cold. The hole hadn't been there the week before. I'd walked through that cemetery just 7 days earlier, checking on some vandalism reports, and I would have noticed a hole that size. No question about it. The people stood around that hole in perfect silence, looking down into it like they were waiting for something. Or someone. And in the red light of the blood moon, their faces looked different. Not quite their own faces, but not entirely strange either. Like they were wearing masks made of their own skin. I don't know how long I watched them standing there. Time gets funny when you're witnessing something that shouldn't exist. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. All I know is that eventually, one by one, they started walking away. Not back toward town, but deeper into the cemetery, toward the old section where some of the graves don't have proper markers anymore. I should have followed them further. Should have seen where they went, what they did next. But something about that hole kept drawing my attention, kept pulling at me like a magnet pulls iron filings. Before I knew what I was doing, I found myself walking toward it. Each step felt like walking through thick honey, like the air itself was getting denser the closer I got to that perfect black circle in the ground. My legs felt heavy, my thoughts felt slow, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded almost like my own was telling me it was okay, it was natural, it was what I was supposed to do. I stopped at the edge of that hole and looked down. I can't tell you what I saw down there. Not because I don't remember. I remember every detail with crystal clarity. But because some things don't translate into words, and some knowledge wasn't meant to be shared. What I will say is this. That hole went deeper than any hole had a right to go, and at the bottom of it was something that had been waiting a very long time for people to come walking in their sleep. Something that had been calling to them, night after night, blood moon after blood moon, with a voice that only the sleeping mind could hear. I stood there at the edge, feeling that pull, feeling the urge to just step forward and let myself fall into whatever was waiting below. It would have been easy, natural, even, like coming home after a long journey. But then I heard something that snapped me back to myself, the sound of my radio crackling to life in my jacket pocket. Dispatch, trying to reach me for some routine call I'd completely forgotten about. The sound of the real world breaking through whatever spell that place had cast over me. I stumbled backward, away from the hole, away from that terrible pull, and ran like I hadn't run since I was a kid afraid of the dark. Ran all the way back to my car, drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and sat in my kitchen until dawn, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The next morning, I went back to the cemetery. Had to see if the hole was still there, had to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The hole was gone. Not filled in, not covered over, gone, like it had never existed. The ground where it had been was smooth and undisturbed, covered with the same grass and weeds as everywhere else. But the people who had been walking that night, they all had the mud. Black clay mud under their fingernails, on their clothes, ground into the treads of their shoes. Physical evidence of something that apparently hadn't happened. I started asking around town after that, casual-like, trying to get a sense of what people remembered from blood moon nights. Most of them stuck to the same story. They'd wake up confused, muddy, with vague memories of walking somewhere important. But a few people, the ones who'd been experiencing it the longest, started admitting to more. Mrs. Henderson told me she remembered feeling like she was going to church, but not any church she'd ever attended. Pete Ramirez said it felt like a family reunion, like he was meeting relatives he'd never known he had. And Sarah Chin, when I pressed her a little, admitted that she'd started having dreams during the day. Dreams about being underground, about being part of something larger than herself, about belonging in a way she'd never belonged before. "It's not scary," she said, and that scared me more than anything else she could have said. "It feels right. It feels like what I'm supposed to be doing." That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've watched the pattern continue, watched more and more people start sleepwalking on blood moon nights, watched the ones who've been doing it longest start to change in small, subtle ways. They're more patient now, more willing to wait. They talk less, smile less, but they're not unhappy. If anything, they seem more content than they used to be, like they've found something the rest of us are still looking for. And they've started looking at me different. Not suspicious, Exactly, but expectant. Like they know I was there that night, like they know I saw the hole, like they're waiting for me to understand something I'm not quite ready to understand yet. The next blood moon is tomorrow night. I've got my calendar marked, my coffee ready, my resolve firm. I'm going to stay awake, stay aware, stay myself. I'm going to figure out what's really happening in Millbrook, and I'm going to find a way to stop it. But I'll be honest with you, part of me, a part that's been growing stronger every day, wonders if stopping it is the right thing to do. The people who walk on blood moon nights don't seem unhappy. They don't seem afraid. They seem like they've found something the rest of us have lost, something we didn't even know we were missing. And last night, I woke up with mud on my boots and no idea why. The mud was still wet, still warm, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear something calling my name. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 43 years, and I've always prided myself on protecting the people in this town. But now I'm starting to wonder, maybe what I need to protect them from isn't what's calling to them in their sleep. Maybe what I need to protect them from is me, and my stubborn refusal to let them go where they need to go. The blood moon rises tomorrow night, and I suspect it's going to be my last night as the man I've always been. Because the mud on my boots is getting thicker, the call in my dreams is getting louder, and the hole in the ground that shouldn't exist is starting to feel like home. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some cases aren't meant to be closed. And some sheriffs, after 43 years of keeping watch, are meant to finally join the people they've been protecting all along. See you on the next blood moon, Millbrook. I'll be the one walking at the front of the line, leading the way to wherever it is we're all supposed to go. And maybe, just maybe, that's not such a terrible thing after all. That old silo's been empty for years. Or so we thought. I've been wearing this badge for 37 years now, seen things that would make most folks lose sleep for weeks. But there's one case that still sits heavy in my chest, like a stone I can't cough up. Happened back in '97, autumn time, when the air gets that peculiar weight to it, and the light starts dying earlier each day. The kind of season when small towns like ours seem to press in on themselves, getting smaller and quieter until you can almost hear the secrets whispering in the walls. The Hendricks farm sits about 4 miles east of town, past where the good road gives way to gravel, and the gravel gives way to dirt that's seen more horse hooves than tire treads. Old man Hendricks had been working that land for near 40 years, same as his daddy before him. Quiet fellow, kept to himself mostly, but reliable as sunrise. Every Tuesday and Friday he'd come into town for supplies, nod to whoever he passed, conduct his business with few words, and head back to his patch of earth. The silo in question sat on the north edge of his property, maybe 100 yards from the main house. Concrete and steel, 50 feet tall, built sometime in the 50s when farming was booming and everyone thought the good times would stretch on forever. But like most things from that era, it had outlived its purpose. Been sitting empty since the early 80s, just another monument to dreams that dried up and blew away. Or that's what we all believed. It was Deputy Martinez who took the call. Tuesday morning, October 14th. Mrs. Hendricks, Sarah, though most folks called her by her maiden name, Sarah Polk, she called in around 7:30, voice thin as paper. "He didn't come in for breakfast," she told Martinez. "Left before dawn to check the north fence line. Always back by 6:30. Always." Now, in most places, a man being an hour late for breakfast wouldn't warrant a phone call to the sheriff's office. But out here, where the land stretches wide and empty, and where a man's routines are about the only reliable thing in an unreliable world, an hour can mean plenty. Sarah knew her husband's patterns better than anyone, and if she was worried enough to call, there was cause for worry. I drove out to the Hendricks place myself. taking the long way past Miller's Creek where the cottonwoods were just starting to turn. The morning had that crisp clarity that October sometimes brings, but underneath it was something else, a heaviness, like the air before a storm that never quite arrives. Sarah was waiting on the porch, still in her house dress, arms wrapped around herself despite the sweater. She was a small woman, bird-like, but with eyes that missed nothing. When she saw my patrol car coming up the drive, something in her posture relaxed just a fraction. "Found his hat," she said before I'd even gotten out of the car. "Down by the north fence. Just sitting there in the middle of the field like he'd set it down careful like." She led me to where she'd found it, a faded John Deere cap, sweat-stained and familiar. It was sitting in a patch of turned earth about 20 yards from the fence line, placed neat as you please, not blown there by wind or dropped in haste. The ground around it was scuffed, like maybe there'd been some kind of struggle, but the marks were strange. Not the clear heel-toe prints you'd expect from a man fighting or running, but something else. Drag marks, maybe, but going in circles. "This how you found it?" I asked. Sarah nodded. "Didn't touch nothing. Knew you'd want to see." I knelt down, studied the ground more careful. The soil was damp from the morning dew, good for holding impressions. But what I saw there didn't make much sense. Alongside the scuff marks were other impressions, round, deep, about the size of a dinner plate. They pressed into the earth with considerable weight, whatever made them. But they didn't follow any pattern I recognized. Not animal tracks, not machinery. Just these perfect circles pressed deep into the soft ground, leading from where the hats sat toward the old silo. That silo loomed in the distance, gray concrete catching the morning light in a way that made it seem to pulse. I'd driven past it hundreds of times over the years, never paid it much mind. But now, crouched in that field with those strange marks leading toward it, the thing seemed different. Bigger somehow. More present. "When's the last time anybody went inside that silo?" I asked. Sarah's face went a shade paler. "Oh, we don't go near it. Haven't for years. Not since." She trailed off, wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "Since what?" "Since the sound started." Now, I should mention that Sarah Hendricks wasn't the type for flights of fancy. She was a practical woman, raised practical, married to a practical man. If she said there were sounds, then there were sounds. "What kind of sounds?" "Hard to say. Like something breathing, but big. Real big. Comes mostly at night, but sometimes during the day too. Deep sound, goes right through your chest. We figured maybe it was the wind, or settling, you know how old buildings do. But wind doesn't breathe regular like." I stood up, brushed the dirt off my knees, and looked again toward the silo. From where we stood, I could see the door at its base, a heavy steel thing, painted green once upon a time but now mostly rust. It was standing slightly ajar. "That door always open." Sarah followed my gaze and went rigid. No, it's not. Harold sealed that up years ago. Welded it shut after." She stopped again. "After what, Sarah?" "After we lost the chickens." This was the first I'd heard about chickens, and I told her so. She looked embarrassed, like she'd said more than she meant to. "Was about 3 years back. We kept a coop on the north side of the house, maybe 50 yards from the silo. Had 23 birds, good layers. One morning we came out and they were gone. All of them. Not a feather left behind, no blood, no sign of struggle. Coop was still locked up tight, but empty as Sunday church. Could have been foxes, coyotes. Could have been. That's what Harold said. But that night, after we found them gone, we heard it for the first time. That breathing from the silo. Deep and slow, like something big sleeping. Harold went out the next morning and welded that door shut. Said whatever was in there could stay in there. I looked at the door again, definitely open now. The darkness beyond it seemed to move, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. I need to take a look inside, I said. Sarah grabbed my arm. Sheriff, Harold said, his last words before he disappeared. He said it's in the silo? Not going to the silo, not near the silo. In it. The weight of her grip, the fear in her voice, it settled over me like a cold blanket. But I had a job to do, and a man was missing. Whatever was in that silo, whatever had taken Harold, I needed to know. I left Sarah at the house and walked a quarter-mile to the silo alone. The morning was warming up, but the closer I got to that concrete tower, the colder it seemed to get. The grass around its base was brown and brittle, like it had been burned, though there was no sign of fire. The air smelled wrong too, not the usual farm smells of earth and growing things, but something else. Something organic but sour, like meat left too long in the sun. The steel door stood open about 2 feet, just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways. Beyond it was darkness so complete it seemed solid. I had my flashlight, a heavy mag light that could punch through the blackest night, but when I clicked it on and pointed it through that doorway, the beam seemed to get swallowed up after just a few feet. I called out Harold's name. My voice echoed strangely inside, not the sharp echo you'd expect from a concrete cylinder, but something softer, muffled, like the sound was being absorbed by something that didn't belong there. The smell was stronger now, that sour sweet stench that made my stomach turn. But underneath it was something else, something that reminded me of childhood trips to the ocean, brine and seaweed and things long dead. I stepped through the doorway. The interior of the silo was wrong. I knew it should be a simple concrete cylinder, maybe some old grain chutes and machinery. But what my flashlight revealed was something else entirely. The walls were covered in something dark and wet, something that seemed to pulse in the light. The floor, which should have been concrete, was soft underfoot, yielding like marsh ground. And the sound Sarah had mentioned, that deep, rhythmic breathing, was loud in here, coming from somewhere above in the darkness. Each breath sent a current through whatever covered the walls, made it ripple like water. I played my light around the interior, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The circular wall curved away into shadow, but there were things attached to it, hanging like cocoons or chrysalises. They were pale and translucent, and inside each one was a dark shape about the size of a man. My light found Harold in the third cocoon I examined. He was suspended maybe 8 feet off the ground, wrapped in something that looked like wet silk. His eyes were open, staring, but there was no recognition in them. No fear, no pain, just a terrible emptiness, like he was looking at something far away and long ago. I called his name again, louder this time. His eyes didn't move, didn't even blink. But something else did. Above us both, in the darkness near the top of the silo, something shifted. Something big enough to make the whole structure creak. My flashlight beam couldn't reach that high, but I could sense it there, could feel its attention like a weight pressing down on me. The breathing sound stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear other things. Wet sounds, sliding sounds, the soft whisper of something large moving through spaces too small for it. And underneath it all, a sound that took me a moment to recognize, the sound of Harold's voice, thin and distant, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I backed toward the door, keeping my light on Harold's still form. That's when I saw the others. More cocoons, dozens of them, attached to the walls at different heights. Some were fresh, the silk still glistening wet. Others were old, dried out, their contents long since desiccated. 23 of them were smaller than the rest, about the size of chickens. I made it to the doorway just as something dropped from above. I caught a glimpse of it in my peripheral vision, something pale and segmented, with too many joints in places where joints shouldn't be. It hit the soft floor with a sound like a wet sack, and I ran. I ran like I hadn't run since I was 12 years old, and being chased by Tommy Miller's old bull. I ran across that dead grass and through the field and didn't stop until I reached my patrol car. Sarah was still on the porch, and when she saw me coming, face white and chest heaving, she knew without being told that Harold wasn't coming home. I called for backup, but what was I going to tell them? That there was something living in the silo, something that collected things in silk cocoons? That Harold Hendricks was hanging in there like a fly in a spider's web, alive but not really there? Instead, I told them it was a crime scene, possible homicide, and that I needed the area secured. By the time the state boys arrived with their equipment and their expertise, I'd had time to think about what story would make sense to people who hadn't seen what I'd seen. We cordoned off the area, brought in crime scene photographers, the whole works. But when we opened that silo door with proper lighting and full documentation, it was just an empty concrete cylinder. Dirty, sure, and it smelled bad, probably from old grain gone to rot, but empty. The walls were concrete and steel, just like they should be. The floor was solid under our feet. Harold Hendricks was never found. The case went cold after 6 months, filed away with all the other mysteries that small towns accumulate over time. The official report blamed it on a possible accident or voluntary disappearance, citing marital problems that everyone knew didn't exist. But I know what I saw in there. I know Harold's still hanging in that cocoon, staring at nothing with empty eyes. And I know that whatever lives in that silo is still there, still breathing its slow, patient breaths, still collecting things. The Hendricks farm was sold at auction the following spring. Sarah moved to her sister's place in Tulsa, never came back, not even for the sale. The new owners are a young couple from the city, have big plans for organic farming and sustainable agriculture. They asked me about the silo, wanted to know if it was structurally sound, if they could use it for storage. I told them it was condemned, that the foundation was compromised. They believed me. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still and the air has that particular weight to it, I can hear it breathing. Deep and slow and patient, like something big sleeping. Waiting. And sometimes, when I drive past the old Hendricks place on my evening rounds, I see that steel door standing open just a crack, just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways. Just like it was that October morning when I learned that some things are better left alone. That was 26 years ago now. I'll be retiring next month, handing over this badge to someone younger, someone who hasn't seen the things I've seen. I've written up my reports, filed my cases, done everything by the book. Except for one file. One manila folder that I keep in the bottom drawer of my desk, locked away where nobody else can find it. It's labeled, Hendricks, Harold, missing person, and inside it is everything I really know about what happened that day. The photos I took with my personal camera before the officials arrived. The plaster casts I made of those round impressions in the field. The sound recordings I made late one night when I went back to the silo alone. I don't know what to do with it. Can't file it with the official records. They'd think I'd lost my mind. Can't destroy it either. Seems like somebody ought to know the truth, even if they can't do anything about it. Maybe I'll leave it for the next sheriff. Let him decide what to do with it. Or maybe I'll take it with me when I go, let it die with me like secrets are supposed to do. But I'll tell you this much, that silo's still out there, still breathing, still collecting. And every now and then, when the wind is right and the air is still, you can hear Harold's voice coming from inside. Thin and distant, like an echo from the bottom of a deep well. He's still trying to tell us something. Still trying to warn us. But some warnings come too late to do any good. The young couple who bought the farm, they're good people. Hard workers, full of hope and plans for the future. They've got a little girl now, maybe 4 years old, with blonde pigtails and a laugh that carries across the fields on summer evenings. Last week I drove by their place on routine patrol. The little girl was playing in the yard, chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk. She waved at me as I passed, smiled that trusting smile that children have before the world teaches them to be afraid. But as I watched her in my rearview mirror, I saw her stop playing. Saw her turn toward the north field where that silo stands silent and patient in the growing dark. She stood there for a long moment, perfectly still, like she was listening to something only she could hear. Then she started walking toward it. I stopped the car, got out, called to her, asked her where she was going. She turned back to me, and for just a moment, her eyes had that same empty look I'd seen in Harold's face all those years ago. That terrible distance, like she was looking at something far away and long ago. "It's calling," she said. "It wants to show me something." I walked her back to the house, told her parents about stranger danger, about not wandering off alone. They thanked me, promised to keep a closer eye on her. But I could see it in their faces too, that same distant look creeping in around the edges. Whatever lives in that silo, it's getting stronger, more patient, learning, and I won't be here much longer to keep watch. God help them all. I followed that light for miles. Or maybe it followed me. 37 years I wore the badge in Millbrook County, and in all that time, I never talked about what happened in the autumn of '89. Not to my deputies, not to my wife, God rest her soul, and certainly not to the folks who came asking questions afterward. But I'm old now, and old men start remembering things they'd rather forget. Maybe it's time someone else knew. Millbrook's the kind of place people drive through without stopping. Population 847 on a good day, less when the kids graduate and head for the cities. We got one main street, a handful of farms, and about 40,000 acres of state forest that stretches north until it hits the Canadian border. Most folks who live here were born here, and most who die here get buried in the cemetery behind the Methodist church where the headstones go back to 1823. The Hendricks place sat about 8 miles out of town, down a county road that turned to gravel, then dirt, then finally petered out into nothing more than tire ruts in the weeds. Old man Hendricks had built his house there in the 50s, back when timber was good money, and he thought he'd make his fortune logging the deep woods. Never did pan out. By the time I knew him, he was pushing 70, living alone in that rambling farmhouse with nothing but his radio for company and a view of trees that went on forever. He came into my office on a Tuesday morning in October, hat in his hands, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. I'd known Hendricks for the better part of 2 decades, and he wasn't the type to spook easy. Spent most of his life in those woods, knew every trail and game path like they were streets in his own neighborhood. But that morning, his hands shook when he lit his cigarette. "There's something in my woods, Sheriff," he said, and his voice had gone thin as paper. "Been watching it for 3 nights now. Same time, same place. Just after sundown." I poured him coffee and waited. Hendricks wasn't a talker on the best of days. "It's a light," he finally said. "Yellow light, like from an old lantern. Moves through the trees about a 1/4 mile behind my house. Slow, like someone's carrying it. Walking." I asked him if he'd seen who was carrying it. "That's just it," he said, and he took a long drag off his cigarette. "I went out there. Took my shotgun and my flashlight, went right to where I saw it. Nothing there. No footprints, no sign anyone had been walking around. But soon as I got back to the house, there it was again. Same light, same spot. Now, we'd had our share of trespassers over the years. Kids drinking beer, hunters who couldn't read posted signs, the occasional vagrant looking for a place to sleep rough. I figured that's all this was, maybe someone camping illegally, using the light to navigate at night. "I'll take a drive out there this evening," I told him. "Have a look around." But Hendricks shook his head. "It ain't natural, Sheriff. I've been in those woods my whole life. This ain't right." The way he said it made something cold settle in my chest. There was fear in his voice, yes, but something else too. Something that sounded almost like reverence. I drove out to the Hendricks place just before sunset, took the patrol car as far as the road would allow, then walked the last half-mile to his house. The October air was crisp and still, carrying the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves. Hendricks met me at his back door, pointed toward the tree line. "Right there," he said. "Give it about 10 minutes." We stood on his back porch, him smoking, me watching the darkening woods. The silence was complete. No birds, no insects, even the wind had died to nothing. Just the sound of our breathing and the distant tick of his house settling. Then I saw it. A soft yellow glow, maybe chest high, moving slowly between the trees. It bobbed gently as it traveled, exactly like someone walking a forest path with a lantern held in front of them. The light was warm, almost comforting, the kind you'd be glad to see if you were lost in those woods after dark. "There," Hendricks whispered, and I could hear his teeth chattering. I watched the light for maybe 5 minutes. It moved in a rough circle, disappearing behind trees, reappearing in clearings, always that same steady pace. Never hurrying, never stopping. Just walking. "Stay here," I told Hendricks, and I headed for the woods. The undergrowth was thick but not impassable. I had my flashlight and I knew roughly where the light had been moving. Should have been simple to intercept it, or at least get close enough to call out to whoever was carrying it. I pushed through brambles and stepped over fallen logs, keeping my eye on where I'd last seen the glow. Nothing. I searched for the better part of an hour, covering every inch of ground where that light had been. No footprints in the soft earth. No broken branches or disturbed leaves. No sign that anyone had walked through there in years, maybe decades. The forest floor was thick with undisturbed moss and fallen timber. When I got back to Hendricks' porch, he was waiting with fresh coffee. "You see it?" he asked. I had to admit I hadn't found anything. But as I said the words, something caught my eye. There, through the trees, maybe 200 yards from where I'd been searching, the light. Moving slow and steady, just like before. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. There was no way someone could have circled around me that fast, not in that dense undergrowth. And I'd been thorough in my search. If there had been anyone in those woods, I would have found them. "How long has this been going on?" I asked Hendricks. 3 nights. Started Sunday. Same time, same route. I stayed until the light disappeared, which it did around 10 o'clock, just vanishing between one moment and the next. Told Hendricks I'd be back the next evening, maybe bring one of my deputies. But I didn't bring anyone. Something told me this was the kind of thing you kept to yourself, at least until you understood what you were dealing with. The next night, I parked at the end of Hendricks Drive and walked to the woods alone. I arrived early, before sunset, and found a good spot about 50 yards inside the tree line where I could observe without being seen. If someone was playing games, I wanted to catch them at it. The light appeared right on schedule. This time, I was ready for it. I had positioned myself where I calculated it would pass closest to my hiding spot. As it approached, I kept perfectly still, watching through the branches. The glow grew brighter as it neared, and I could make out more details. It was definitely lantern light, that warm yellow flicker you get from a kerosene flame. But there was something wrong with the way it moved. Too smooth. Too steady. Like it was floating rather than being carried. When it was maybe 20 feet away, I stepped out from behind my tree. "Hold it right there," I called out. The light stopped. For a long moment, we faced each other across that dark forest. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel sweat on my palms despite the cool air. The light hung there, motionless, and I had the strangest feeling that it was looking back at me. "I'm Sheriff Morrison," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need you to identify yourself." The light began to move again. Not away from me, but toward me. I've faced down armed suspects, drunk drivers, domestic disputes that turned violent. I thought I knew what fear was. But standing in those woods with that light approaching, I felt something I'd never experienced before. A deep, primal terror that seemed to come from somewhere below conscious thought. The light stopped about 10 feet away. Up close, it was impossible to see anything beyond the glow itself. No lantern, no hand holding it, no person attached to it. Just that soft, steady light hanging in the darkness. I reached for my radio, thinking to call for backup, but my hands wouldn't work properly. My fingers felt numb, clumsy. The radio slipped from my grip and clattered to the forest floor. That's when the light began to move away. Not quickly, not frantically, just that same unhurried pace. As if my presence was expected, accounted for, but ultimately unimportant. I watched it disappear deeper into the woods, and I stood there for a long time afterward, trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. When I finally bent to retrieve my radio, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the soft earth around my feet, there were footprints. But not mine. I was still standing in my original position. These prints were smaller, older looking, and they led away in the same direction the light had taken. I followed them. The trail was easy to track at first. The prints were clear in the damp soil, obviously fresh. But after about 100 yards, they began to fade. Not gradually, the way tracks normally disappear as the ground gets harder, but abruptly. As if whoever was making them was slowly becoming lighter, less substantial. After 200 yards, the prints were gone entirely. I spent the rest of that night walking those woods, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, looking for any trace of the light or its maker. Found nothing but trees and shadows and the growing certainty that I was in over my head. The third night, I brought a camera. Old Polaroid I kept in the office for crime scenes. If there was something to see, I was going to document it. Maybe then I could begin to make sense of what was happening out there. The light appeared as expected, and this time I was ready. As it passed through a small clearing about 40 yards away, I raised the camera and triggered the flash. The light disappeared instantly. Not gradually, not by moving away, it just vanished the moment the flash went off, like I'd somehow broken whatever spell was keeping it visible. I waited, but it didn't return. When the Polaroid developed, all it showed was dark forest. No light, no figure, nothing but trees and shadows. I should have left it alone then. Should have told Hendricks the situation was resolved and moved on to other cases. But something about that light had gotten under my skin. The way it moved, the way it had seemed to acknowledge my presence. The footprints that appeared and disappeared like something out of a fever dream. I started researching. The county library had old newspaper files going back to the 1890s, and I spent my lunch hours there, searching for anything that might explain what we'd seen. Most of it was routine small-town news, births, deaths, harvest reports, the occasional fire or accident. But buried in the October 1934 edition of the Millbrook Gazette, I found something that made my hands shake. Local man missing in state forest. Harold Wickham, 34, of Millbrook, has been missing for 6 days after entering the state forest north of town. Wickham, a surveyor by trade, was last seen Tuesday morning carrying his equipment and a kerosene lantern toward the deep woods section known locally as Deadman's Hollow. Search parties organized by Sheriff Thomas Pike have found no trace of Wickham or his equipment. The search will continue pending weather conditions. Wickham leaves behind a wife and 2 small children. I kept reading. A follow-up article the next week reported that Harold Wickham's body had never been found despite extensive searching. The case was eventually closed and listed as an accidental death, probably due to exposure or injury in the deep woods. But what caught my attention was a small item buried on page 3 of the November 15th edition. Several residents of the North County area have reported seeing strange lights in the state forest during evening hours. Sheriff Pike reminds citizens that search efforts for Harold Wickham have been concluded, and any lights seen in the woods are likely hunters or other legitimate forest users. I kept digging. Over the next 55 years, I found 17 similar reports scattered through various newspapers. Always the same basic story. Someone sees a light in the woods, usually in the area north of town. Sometimes there's an investigation, sometimes not. But the reports never really stop. The most recent was from 1987, just 2 years before Hendricks started seeing his light. A hunter claimed he'd followed a lantern glow for 3 miles before realizing he was lost. When he finally found his way back to his truck, he said the light had followed him, staying just visible through the trees until he reached the road. That's when I started to understand what we were dealing with. The 4th night, I went alone again. But this time, I didn't try to approach the light or interfere with it. I just watched. It appeared in the same area, began its familiar route through the trees. But tonight, something was different. The light seemed brighter, more defined. And it was moving in a larger circle, covering more ground. Coming closer to the edge of the woods. Closer to Hendricks' house. I radioed to check on the old man, had dispatch call his number. No answer. That worried me. Hendricks never left his house after dark, and he always answered his phone. I made my way back to his place, found the house dark except for the kitchen light. The back door was standing open. "Hendricks?" I called out. No response. I searched the house quickly. No sign of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. But when I looked out his back window, I could see the light in the woods, closer now than I'd ever seen it before. And I could see a second light, smaller and dimmer, moving toward the first one. A flashlight. I ran for the woods, crashing through the underbrush, trying to reach whatever was happening out there before it was too late. But the forest seemed to have grown thicker, more tangled. Branches caught at my clothes, roots grabbed at my feet. The harder I tried to move, the more the woods seemed to resist me. By the time I fought my way to where I'd seen the lights, there was nothing there. Just silence and darkness, and the smell of kerosene lingering in the still air. I searched until dawn but never found any trace of Hendricks. No footprints, no disturbed undergrowth, no sign he'd ever been in those woods at all. It was like the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him. The official report listed him as a missing person, probable accidental death in the state forest. Same as Harold Wickham 55 years before. Same as others I was starting to suspect, going back much further than that. But I knew better. Whatever was in those woods had been waiting a long time, maybe decades, for someone to follow its light far enough into the darkness. Hendricks had finally gotten too curious, or too lonely, or maybe just too tired of being afraid. I never saw the light again after that night. Maybe it got what it was looking for. Maybe it moved on to other woods, other people. Or maybe it's still out there, patient as the trees themselves, waiting for the next person who can't resist following a warm glow in the darkness. I retired 6 months later, sold my house in town and moved to Florida, as far from those woods as I could get. But even now, 34 years later, I still catch myself looking over my shoulder when I walk at night. Still feel that old familiar chill when I see a yellow light in the distance. Because some part of me knows the truth that I've never been able to speak aloud until now. That light didn't just appear in Hendrix Woods by accident. It was looking for something. Someone. And once it finds you, once it knows you've seen it, it never really goes away. It just waits for you to follow it home. Last week, my neighbor down here in Clearwater mentioned seeing a strange light in the nature preserve behind his house. Yellow glow, moving slow through the palmetto scrub just after sunset. Asked if I thought he should report it to somebody. I told him no. Some things are better left alone. But I've been packing my bags, just the same. Because I followed that light for miles, all those years ago. And maybe, just maybe, it followed me.